facts. These people can be rebutted by saying that individuals certainly do demonstrate certain characteristics belonging to their ancestors, because the element of spirit and soul that enters physical existence through birth derives its bodily nature from what heredity provides. However, this says nothing more than that a being shares the idiosyncrasies of the medium in which it is immersed. Unbiased minds will not deny the justification for the comparison, although it is certainly a strange and trivial one, if we say that the fact that a human being appears clothed in the traits of his or her ancestors says just as little about the origin of this individual's personal characteristics as being wet from falling into the water says about the wet person's inner character. Furthermore, the fact that the most illustrious name stands at the end of a bloodline demonstrates that the bearer of this name needed that bloodline in order to fashion the body that was necessary for the development of his or her entire personality. This proves nothing about the quote-unquote inheritability of the personal element itself. In fact, it proves the exact opposite as far as healthy logic is concerned. If personal talents actually were passed down within a family, they would have to stand at the beginning of a bloodline to be transmitted to the descendants. The fact that they are present at the end, however, is evident that they are not passed down. Of course, it would be easy to misunderstand the statement that if an individual's personal gifts were simply subject to the law of heredity, they would have to appear at the beginning of a bloodline. We might say, quote, well, they cannot appear there because they have to develop first, unquote. This is not a valid objection, because when we want to prove that something has been inherited from a predecessor, we have to demonstrate that the predecessor's previously existing trait becomes evident again in a descendant. If it is apparent that something is present at the beginning of a bloodline and reappears later on, it would be justified to speak of heredity. But we cannot do this if something that was not present earlier shows up at the end of a bloodline. The reversal of the sentence above was only intended to show that the idea of heredity is an impossible one. This is not intended to deny the fact that those who speak of spiritual causation in life often add just as much to the confusion. They often speak in terms that are much too general and indefinite. If we say that an individual's personality is an accumulation of inherited characteristics, that can certainly be compared to the statement that a number of metal parts have assembled themselves into a clock. But it must also be admitted that many statements about spiritual worlds are no different from the statement that the parts of a clock are incapable of putting themselves together, so that the hands actually move, and that therefore something spiritual must be present to make sure this movement happens. Faced with such a statement, we actually have more reason to say, quote, I'm not going to bother anymore with these quote-unquote mystical beings that move the hands of the clock. I'd rather find out about the mechanical relationships that make this happen, unquote. It is not at all a question of merely knowing that there is something spiritual, the watchmaker, behind mechanical objects, such as clocks. The only significant thing here is to become familiar with the watchmaker's thoughts, which existed before the clock was assembled. We can rediscover these thoughts in the mechanism of the clock. Merely dreaming or fantasizing about the supersensible element never gives rise to anything except confusion, because it is unable to satisfy the opponents of spiritual views, who are quite right when they say that such references to supersensible beings in the abstract do not help us understand the actual facts of the matter. Of course, these opponents may also say the same thing about the statements of spiritual science, which are specific and definite. In that case, however, we can point to how the activity of a hidden spiritual element affects our outer life. We can say, quote, suppose it's true what spiritual research claims to have established by means of observation, that during the purification period we undergo after death, our souls experience how specific actions of ours in the previous life hinder our further development, and that while we are experiencing this, we develop an impulse to make up for the consequences of these actions. Let's assume that we bring this impulse with us into a new life, and that it then shapes character traits that put us in a position to make up for what we have done. If we look at the sum total of such impulses, we then have a reason why we are born into certain surroundings as a matter of destiny, unquote. The same can be applied to a different assumption. Once again, let's assume that spiritual science is right in saying that the fruits of a bygone life are incorporated into an individual's spiritual seed, and that in the land of spirits, where we spend the time between death and a new life, these fruits ripen so that they can be transformed into predispositions and abilities that will appear in that new life, shaping our personalities to reflect the effects of what we have gained from a prior life. If we make these assumptions and use them to observe life in an unbiased way, we will see that they make it possible for us to acknowledge all the realities of the sense world in their full truth and significance. At the same time, they clarify everything that must always remain incomprehensible to those who base themselves strictly on sense-perceptible facts while turning their attention to the spiritual world. And above all, any illogical assumptions will disappear. For instance, the one to the effect that because the most illustrious name appears at the end of a bloodline, the bearer of that name must have inherited his or her talents. The supersensible facts communicated by spiritual science make life logically comprehensible. However, conscientious truth-seekers who have no personal experience in the spiritual world but are attempting to chart a course among the facts will still be able to raise an important objection by claiming that it is inadmissible to assume the validity of any fact simply because it enables us to explain something that would otherwise be unexplainable. An objection of this sort is surely totally meaningless for anyone who knows the facts in question as a result of direct supersensible perception. And later sections of this book will indicate the path people can take to become personally familiar with the law of spiritual causation, as well as with other spiritual facts that are described here. For those who do not choose to take this path, however, this objection can indeed be significant. Its refutation is also valuable for those who have decided on this path, and for them, accepting this objection in the right way is the best first step. It is absolutely true that if we have no knowledge of something, we should not assume that the thing exists simply because it explains things that would otherwise remain unexplainable. However, in the case of the spiritual facts that have been presented here, the matter is actually quite different. If we assume that these facts are true, we experience not only the intellectual result that life becomes comprehensible, but also something quite different. Let's imagine that something happens to us that causes us considerable pain and embarrassment. We can react to this in one of two ways. We can be distressed about the incident and succumb to feeling embarrassed or even be overcome with pain, or we can relate to it quite differently, telling ourselves that in a previous life we ourselves actually created the force that led us to this event. In fact, we've brought this thing upon ourselves. We can then kindle in ourselves all the feelings that are the results of a thought like this. Of course, for it to have such results for all our feelings and sensations, we have to experience this thought with the utmost sincerity and with all our strength. If we manage to do this, we will have an experience that can best be illustrated by means of a comparison. Let's assume that two people get hold of a stick of sealing wax. One of them makes intellectual comments about its quote-unquote inner nature. No matter how clever these comments are, people can easily retort that this quote-unquote inner nature is pure fantasy if it doesn't show itself in any way. But the other person rubs the sealing wax with a cloth and shows that it attracts small particles. There is a great difference between the thoughts that ran through the first person's mind and prompted his or her remarks and the thoughts of the second person. The first person's thoughts have no consequences for reality, but the second person's thoughts have lured a real thing, an actual force, out of hiding. This is also the case with imagining that a former life has implanted in us the power to encounter a certain event. Simply imagining this arouses a real force in us that allows us to meet the event in a way that is very different from how we would have met it if we had not entertained this thought. The event's inherent necessity dawns on us, whereas otherwise we would only have been able to see it as a coincidence. We will immediately understand that since what we imagined was strong enough to show us the facts of the matter, we must have had the right idea. If we repeat inner processes like this, they begin to be a source of inner strength, and their validity is confirmed by their fruitful consequences. This validity gradually becomes a force to be reckoned with. Such processes have a healing effect on spirit, soul, and body. They foster life in every respect. We become aware that while this allows us to take our place in the context of life in the right way, considering only a single life between birth and death means succumbing to delusion and falsehood, this knowledge makes our souls stronger. Although people can only produce this purely inner proof of spiritual causation for themselves through individual inner activity, it is possible for everyone to have such proof. However, those who have not produced it for themselves cannot evaluate its power to prove, while those who have produced it will no longer have any doubts about it. This need not surprise us at all. It's quite natural that such an intimate component of our innermost being, our personality, can only be adequately proved by means of the most intimate experience. However, it is not legitimate to object that since such matters conform so closely to inner experience, each person must deal with them individually, and that they are therefore not an appropriate subject for spiritual science. Of course, each person must have the experience for him or herself, just as each person must understand the solution to a mathematical equation. But the way to gain this experience holds good for all human beings, just as the method for solving a mathematical equation is valid for all. Leaving aside supersensible observations, of course, we should not deny that the above-mentioned proof, which is based on the strength-generating force of the thoughts in question, is the only one that will stand up to any unbiased logic. All other considerations are certainly very important, but they all have aspects that leave them open to attack. If we have acquired a sufficiently unbiased view, however, the fact that human beings are educable will constitute logically effective proof for us that there is a spiritual being struggling for existence within the body that envelops it. We will compare animals to human beings, telling ourselves that an animal's normal characteristics and capabilities appear definitively at birth, clearly showing how the animal's heredity predetermines it and how it will develop under the influence of the outer world. We can see how a young chick carries out vital functions in a certain way from the very moment of its birth. In human beings, however, upbringing and education establish a relationship between our inner soul activity and something that can exist without any connection to heredity. We are also capable of assimilating the effects of outer influences, and all educators know that such influences must be met by forces coming from within the person in question. If this is not the case, any attempt at education will be in vain. Unbiased educators are aware of a clear-cut boundary between inherited predispositions and the personal inner forces shining through them, which can come from earlier lives. It is true that the proofs we can advance for such things are not as quote-unquote weighty as the proofs of certain facts of physics that can be demonstrated by means of a pair of scales. But then these are subtle and intimate aspects of our lives, and if we have a sense for them, their intangible proofs are as conclusive, or more so, than tangible reality. The objection that animals can also be trained and can acquire characteristics and faculties through education is not valid to those who are able to see the essentials. Aside from the fact that all kinds of intermediary states exist in the world, the results of training an animal do not fuse with its personal nature in at all the same way as this happens in humans. It has even been stated that the abilities domestic animals acquire through training and through living together with human beings are inheritable, that is, that they work directly on the level of the species rather than on the individual level. Darwin describes how dogs fetch and carry without being trained to do so or having seen it done. Who would make similar claims about human education? There are thinkers whose observations have made them go beyond the idea that human beings are put together from outside by means of purely hereditary forces. These thinkers have worked their way up to the idea that a spiritual being and individuality precedes and shapes our physical existence. Many of them, however, do not find it possible to grasp the existence of repeated earthly lives whose fruits are present in the interim as formative forces helping to build up the human being. Let's hear what one such thinker has to say. In his book Anthropology, Emanuel Hermann Fichte, son of the famous Fichte, cites the observations that led him to the following conclusion, quote, "In the fullest sense of the word, the parents do not produce the child. They make not only the organic substance available, but also the intermediate sensory soul element that is evident in the child's temperament, unique soul coloring, specialization of impulses and the like, whose common source is fantasy, in that broader sense that we have already established. Such a unique mixture and union of the parents' souls is unmistakable in all these elements of the personality. It is completely justifiable to explain them as purely a product of procreation, especially if, as we have concluded, procreation is to be seen as an actual soul process. But precisely the crucial central point of the personality is lacking here, for a deeper and more penetrating observation reveals that even these idiosyncrasies of mind and soul are only garments that cloak the child's real spiritual ideal predispositions, instruments that are capable of furthering or hindering the development of these predispositions, but in no way capable of creating them out of themselves." Footnote: Emanuel Hermann Fichte, 1796 to 1879, Anthropologie, Leipzig, 1860, pages 528 and 532. I. H. Fichte was a philosopher and edited the works of his father, philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, 1762 to 1814, a transcendental idealist who attempted to perfect Kant's ideas. End of footnote. Further on we read, "Each person existed previously in accordance with his or her fundamental spiritual form. Spiritually considered, no individual resembles another any more than one species of animal resembles another." End quote. These thoughts go just far enough to permit a spiritual being to enter our physical bodily nature. However, since this being's formative forces are not derived from causes in previous lives, it would have to arise from a divine primal foundation each time a personality comes into existence. If we assume this to be true, there is no possibility of explaining the relationship that exists between predispositions that work their way out from inside us and what comes from our outer earthly surroundings and approaches our inner being in the course of life. The inner human being, springing anew for each individual out of a divine primal foundation, would have to be a total stranger to what confronts it in earthly life. For this not to be the case, as in fact it is not, the inner human being must have already been connected to the outer world. It must not be living in it for the first time. Unbiased educators can clearly perceive that they are introducing their students to results of earthly life that are indeed strange to their merely inherited traits of character, yet make them feel as if they had already taken part in the work that produces these results. If we consider the life of present-day humanity from all points of view, the only satisfactory explanation for it is provided by repeated earthly lives, and the facts that spiritual research reveals about existence in the spiritual realm between these earthly lives. The expression, quote-unquote, present-day humanity, is used quite deliberately here. Spiritual research shows that when the cycle of earthly lives first began, the conditions facing spiritual beings entering their bodily garments were quite different from what they are at present. In the following chapters we will go back to this primeval state of humanity. Once the results of spiritual science have demonstrated how human beings took on their present form in the context of the Earth's evolution, it will then be possible to point out more precisely how the human being's essential spiritual core comes from supersensible worlds and enters its bodily garments, as well as, quote, how human destiny, unquote, human destiny, unquote, the spiritual law of causation, develops. The end of chapter 3 of An Outline of Esoteric Science. The chapter is called Sleep and Death. This is chapter 4 of An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Steiner. It is 114 paragraphs long, a rather long chapter, entitled Cosmic Evolution and the Human Being. Introductory thoughts. In previous chapters, we saw that our human makeup consists of 4 parts: the physical body, the life body, the astral body, and the vehicle of the I. The I works within the other 3 elements to transform them. On a lower level, this transformation results in the sentient soul, the mind soul, and the consciousness soul. On a higher level, in the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit body. Now, these members of our human nature relate to the cosmos as a whole in a great variety of ways, and their evolution is linked to that of the cosmos. By considering cosmic evolution, we gain insight into the deeper secrets of our human makeup. It is obvious that our life is connected in many ways to our surroundings, to where it evolves. Even external science, through the facts available to it, has been forced to see that the earth itself, our dwelling in the most comprehensive sense of the word, has undergone an evolution. Science refers to stages of the earth's existence when human beings did not yet exist on this planet in their present form, and it demonstrates how humankind slowly and gradually evolved from very basic stages of civilization to our present circumstances. Thus, science too has come to believe that there is a connection between human evolution and the evolution of our celestial body, the earth. Spiritual science traces this connection by means of knowledge that derives its facts from perception enhanced by spiritual organs. Parenthesis, spiritual science is used here to mean the same thing as quote-unquote esoteric science, as should be evident from the context. Parenthesis. In doing so, it becomes apparent that the actual inner spiritual beings of human individuals have gone through a series of lives on this earth. In this way, spiritual research arrives at a point in time in the distant past when the inner essence of each human being first embarked on an outer life in the present sense of the word. This first earthly embodiment was when the I first began to be active within the 3 bodies, astral body, life body, and physical body, and to carry the fruits of this work over into a subsequent life. If we shift our view back to this point in time, we will become aware that within the earthly conditions encountered by the I, the physical, etheric, and astral bodies were already developed and interconnected in a certain way. The I then united for the first time with the being consisting of these 3 bodies, and began to take part in their further evolution. Until reaching this level where they first encountered an I, they had been evolving without one. To answer our questions about how these 3 bodies arrived at a stage of development where they were capable of receiving an I, and about how this I itself came into existence and became capable of working within these bodies, spiritual scientific research must go still further back in time. We can only answer these questions by tracing the development of the earth itself by spiritual scientific means. Through such research, we arrive at this planet's beginning point. A view based solely on facts supplied by our physical senses is not far-reaching enough to come to conclusions that have anything to do with this beginning. One such view concludes that all of the earth's substance formed out of a primeval mist. It cannot be the task of this book to go into such ideas in more detail, because spiritual research is more concerned with spiritual causes lying behind matter than with the more mere material processes of Earth's evolution. As an example, if there is a person in front of us who is raising a hand, this can suggest 2 different ways of looking at this action. We can either investigate the mechanism of the person's arm and the rest of his or her body and describe the process that is taking place as a purely physical one. Or we can turn our spiritual attention to what is going on in the person's soul and to his or her inner motivation for raising a hand. In a similar way, researchers schooled in spiritual perception see spiritual processes behind all the processes of the physical sense-perceptible world. To them, any transformation in the material aspect of the earth is a manifestation of spiritual forces lying behind matter. But if we go further and further back in time in our spiritual observation of the life of the earth, we eventually arrive at the point in evolution where matter first began to exist. This material element developed out of the spiritual. Before this point, only the spiritual element was present. Through further spiritual observation, we can see how this spiritual element partially condensed into matter, so to speak. The process taking place before us is the same thing on a higher level as what would take place if we were observing a container full of water undergoing some ingenious cooling process so that lumps of ice gradually form. Just as we see ice condensing out of something that used to be all water, spiritual observation allows us to trace how material things, processes, and beings condense out of an element that was formerly completely spiritual in character. This is how the earth developed from a spiritual cosmic being into a physical planet. Everything materially connected to it condensed out of what was formerly spiritually connected to it. However, we must not imagine that the spiritual element is ever totally transformed into matter. Matter is always only a transformed portion of the original spiritual element, which remains the actual guiding principle even while matter is evolving. It is reasonable to state that a view restricting itself to sense-perceptible physical processes and to what our intellect can conclude from them is not able to inform us about the spiritual element in question here. Let's imagine a being with senses that are capable of perceiving ice, but not the finer state of water, from which ice emerges by means of cooling. For this being, water would simply not be present and could only be perceived when parts of it turned to ice. Likewise, the spiritual element that lies concealed behind earthly processes remains hidden from those who do not admit the existence of anything not present to the physical senses. If such people draw correct conclusions about earlier conditions on the earth from current physical, perceptible facts, they will only be able to go back to the point in evolution where the pre-existing spiritual element partially condensed into matter. Their method of observation perceives as little of the pre-existing spiritual element as it does of the spiritual element currently at work behind matter. Only in the last chapters of this book will we be able to speak about the paths we must follow in order to learn to use spiritual perception to look back on the earlier states of the earth that are mentioned here. For the moment it should only be mentioned that as far as spiritual research is concerned, facts about even the most distant past have not disappeared. Once a being has achieved physical existence, the material part of it disappears after the death of its body. However, the spiritual forces that have expelled this bodily element do not disappear in the same way. They leave their traces, exact reproductions of themselves, in the spiritual foundations of the world. If we are able to raise our perception from the level of the visible world to the invisible, we ultimately find ourselves face to face with something comparable to a mighty spiritual panorama that records all the bygone processes of the world. These imperishable traces of everything spiritual may be called the Akashic record. If we designate the spiritually lasting element in the world, events, as their Akashic essence, in contrast to their transient forms. Now at this point it must be said again that research into supersensible realms of existence can only be carried out with the help of spiritual perception, which in this case means reading the Akashic record. However, what has already been said in earlier parts of this book about similar instances also holds good here. Although supersensible facts can only be discovered by means of supersensible perception, once they have been discovered and communicated by the science of the supersensible, they can be understood by ordinary thinking, at least if it attempts to be truly unbiased. In the pages that follow, information on the Earth's evolutionary stages will be communicated from the standpoint of supersensible knowledge. The transformations our planet has undergone will be followed all the way down to its present-day state. If we consider what now actually confronts us as mere sense perception, and then absorb what supersensible knowledge has to say about how what presently exists has been evolving since time immemorial, and if our thinking is truly impartial, we will be able to say, first of all, what this knowledge describes is thoroughly logical. Secondly, when we accept what is communicated by supersensible research as true, we can understand how the things we encounter have become what they are. Now, when we speak of logic in this context, of course, this doesn't mean that there is no possibility of logical error in any accounts of supersensible research. We will only speak of logic here in the same sense that we speak of it in ordinary life, in the physical world. Just as we are challenged to present things logically in the physical world, in spite of the fact that individuals presenting the facts of any given subject can fall into logical error, the same is true in supersensible research. It can even happen that researchers who are capable of perception in supersensible domains may succumb to error in presenting their results logically, and may be corrected by someone who, although not capable of supersensible perception, has the capacity for sound thinking. Essentially, however, there can be no objection to the logic applied in supersensible research. It should be totally unnecessary to emphasize that nothing can be said against the facts themselves on purely logical grounds. Just as the existence of a whale in the physical world can never be proved logically, but only by seeing one, only spiritual perception can recognize supersensible facts as such. However, it cannot be emphasized enough that before attempting to observe the spiritual world through our own perception, we must first acquire an overview of it, both by means of logic, as was indicated earlier, and by realizing how universally understandable the sense-perceptible manifest world becomes if we assume that the communications of esoteric science are correct. If we reject this path of preparation, all our experience in the supersensible world remains uncertain and even dangerous. We merely grope our way around. That's why this book presents the supersensible facts of Earth's evolution first, before discussing the actual path to supersensible knowledge. We should also keep in mind that if we use thinking as our exclusive means of finding our way into what supersensible knowledge has to say, this is not at all comparable to simply listening to an account of some physical process we cannot see for ourselves. In itself, pure thinking is already a supersensible activity. To the extent that it is a sense-oriented process, thinking cannot lead to supersensible processes all by itself. But if we apply it to the supersensible processes reported by supersensible perception, it then grows into the supersensible world on its own. In fact, even one of the very best ways of achieving perception in the supersensible domain is to grow into the higher world by thinking about the information supersensible knowledge conveys. If we do it this way, we enter the higher world with the greatest possible clarity. This is why a certain trend in spiritual scientific research considers this type of thinking to be the best possible first step in any spiritual scientific training. It should seem quite understandable that this book does not describe how the outer world confirms the supersensible with regard to every detail of Earth's evolution as perceived in the spirit. That was not what was intended when it was said that the hidden element can be detected everywhere in its manifest effects. What was meant was that everything we encounter can gradually be illuminated and become understandable if we see manifest events in the light provided by spiritual science. In the following pages, the manifest element's confirmation of the hidden element will be referred to in only a few characteristic instances in order to show how this can be done at any point in the course of practical life, wherever we choose to do so. An overview of planetary incarnations. If we follow the Earth's development in reverse, in the sense of the above-mentioned spiritual scientific method of research, we arrive at a stage when our planet existed in a spiritual state. If we continue researching still further back in time, however, we find that the spiritual element previously existed as a physical embodiment of a sort. That is, we encounter a bygone physical planetary state that was later spiritualized. Still later, it rematerialized and was transformed into our Earth. The Earth as we know it thus appears as the reincarnation of an ancient planet. But spiritual science can go still further back, and when it does, it finds that this whole process was repeated 2 more times. This Earth of ours has undergone 3 prior planetary stages with intervening stages of spiritualization. The further back we trace these incarnations, the more subtle and delicate in character the physical element becomes. When faced with the descriptions that follow, it's natural to wonder how anyone of sound mind can possibly assume the existence of cosmic evolutionary stages lying so far back in the past. It must be said in response that for those who are now able to see and understand the spiritual element hidden in what is perceptible to the senses, insight into earlier stages of evolution, no matter how distant, is not an impossibility. Talking about evolution in the sense intended here is meaningless only for those who do not acknowledge this hidden spiritual element in the present. For those who do, previous stages of evolution are present in their perception of the present one, just as the 1-year-old child is still present in their perception of a 50-year-old person. You may object that in this example, in addition to the 50-year-old, 1-year-old children and all the stages in between are actually there for us to see. That's true. But it is equally true of the evolution of the spiritual element in the sense intended here. Anyone who has come to an objective conclusion on this matter will also see that in any comprehensive observation of the present, that also includes its spiritual element. Past evolutionary stages really are present along with the perfected stages of present-day evolution, just as 1-year-old babies are present along with 50-year-olds. If we can simply distinguish between the different successive stages of evolution, it is possible to see primeval events within the earthly events of the present. Now, in the form in which we are currently evolving, human beings appeared for the first time in the 4th of the above-mentioned planetary incarnations, the actual Earth itself. The essential feature of our current human makeup is that it comprises 4 parts: the physical body, the life body, the astral body, and the I. However, this composite figure would not have been able to appear if it had not been prepared by the circumstances of prior evolution. Within the previous planetary incarnation, beings developed that already possessed 3 of the present 4 components of the human being: the physical body, the life body, and the astral body. These beings, who could be called the predecessors of human beings in a certain respect, still had no I. But they had developed the 3 other parts and their interrelationships to the point of becoming mature enough to then receive the I. Thus, our predecessors on the planet in its previous incarnation achieved a degree of maturity in the 3 parts they possessed. This planetary incarnation then passed over into a spiritual state, out of which a new physical planetary state then developed, namely that of the Earth. In this Earth, our matured human predecessors were present in a seminal state, so to speak. The entire planet, having undergone spiritualization and reappearance in a new form, was able to offer these embryonic humans with their physical, etheric, and astral bodies not only the possibility of developing to their previous level again, but also the possibility of moving beyond it by receiving the I. The Earth phase of evolution, therefore, fell into 2 parts. In the first period, the Earth itself appeared as a reincarnation of the previous planetary stage. This recapitulation period, however, took place on a higher level than that of the previous incarnation because of the intervening stage of spiritualization. And at this point, the Earth contained the seminal stages of our predecessors from the previous planet. These first developed to their previous level. Once they had achieved it, the first period was over. Because of its own higher level of evolution, however, the Earth could then develop these seminal human beings still further by making them capable of receiving the eye. The second period in this Earth phase of evolution is characterized by the unfolding of the eye within the physical, etheric, and astral bodies. Just as humankind is being brought to a higher level by the Earth phase of evolution, this was also the case in each of the earlier planetary incarnations, since a human element was already present even during the first of these incarnations. This is why we can shed light on the essential nature of present-day human beings by tracing our evolution back to the very distant past, to the first planetary incarnation. Now, supersensible research gives names to these planetary incarnations, calling the first Saturn, the second Sun, S-U-N, the third Moon, and the fourth Earth. We must keep clearly in mind, however, that these classifications must not immediately be associated with the use of the same names for the components of our present-day solar system. Saturn, Sun, and Moon are intended as names for evolutionary forms the Earth went through in the past. The relationships between these worlds of the ancient past and the celestial bodies that make up our present solar system will become clear in the course of the descriptions that follow. It will then also become clear why these names were chosen. Conditions during these 4 planetary incarnations will now be described, but only in brief outline. The processes, beings, and destinies on Saturn, Sun, and Moon were truly as varied as on Earth itself, so only a few individual characteristics of these conditions will be emphasized in order to illustrate how earthly conditions developed out of earlier ones. We must also keep in mind that the further back we go, the less similar these conditions are to the present day, and yet in order to describe them at all, we have to characterize them by using mental images derived from present-day earthly circumstances. Thus, when we use words such as light or heat with regard to these earlier stages, we must not forget that they do not mean exactly the same thing as what we now call light and heat, and yet this terminology is correct, because what light and heat developed out of is apparent to observers of the supersensible at earlier stages of evolution. By following the descriptions given here, we will be able to gather from the context what mental images we need in order to arrive at illustrations and comparisons that characterize events that took place in the far distant past. This difficulty in finding suitable descriptions becomes especially significant with regard to planetary conditions prior to the Moon incarnation. The conditions prevailing during the Moon incarnation itself still showed a certain similarity to earthly conditions, so when we attempt to describe them, their similarity provides certain clues about how to express supersensibly acquired perceptions in clear ideas. It is a different matter when the Saturn and Sun phases of evolution are described. What is accessible to clairvoyant observation there is very different from the objects and beings belonging to our present sphere of life, and this makes it extremely difficult to bring these ancient realities into the scope of supersensible consciousness. But since our present makeup cannot be understood without going back as far as the Saturn state, these realities must be described. These descriptions will certainly not be misunderstood by anyone who keeps this difficulty in mind and is aware that much of what is said is more of an allusion to actual realities than an exact description of them. A contradiction might be found between what is said here and on the following pages and what is said in the paragraph beginning on page 125 about the past continuing to exist in the present. We might imagine that an earlier Saturn, Sun, or Moon state or even a human form such as is described here as having existed during those bygone stages, does not exist anywhere alongside the current state of our Earth. It is true that there are no Saturn, Sun, and Moon humans running around among Earthlings, in the same way that there are little children running around among 50-year-olds. However, humankind's earlier states are supersensibly perceptible within earthly human beings. In order to recognize this, we must only have acquired a power of discrimination that includes the full scope of life's circumstances. Just as the little child is present along with the 50-year-old, the corpse, the sleeper, and the dreamer are also present along with the living, waking, earthly human being. Even if these various manifestations of the present-day human being are not the direct equivalents of the various stages of evolution, an objective observer will nonetheless see these stages in them. The body is the oldest of the present four elements of our makeup, and in its own way it is also the one that has achieved the greatest degree of perfection. Supersensible research shows that this physical human element was already present during the Saturn phase of evolution. However, as will become evident in the course of this description, the form it had on Saturn was something completely different from the present physical human body. It is inherent in the nature of this present physical body that it can only survive in connection with the life body, astral body, and I, as has been described earlier in this book. This connection did not yet exist on Saturn. At that time, the physical body was undergoing its first evolutionary stage and did not incorporate these other elements. It matured enough to receive a life body only in the course of the Saturn phase of evolution. But in order for it to actually do so, Saturn first had to spiritualize and then reincarnate as Sun. During the Sun incarnation, what the physical body had become on Saturn had to develop all over again, as if from a residual embryo, before it could imbue itself with an ether body. Incorporating an ether body changed the character of the physical body, raising it to a second level of perfection. Something similar took place during the Moon phase of evolution, when our predecessors, having evolved from the Sun to the Moon, incorporated the astral body. This transformed the physical body for a third time, raising it to a third level of perfection. The life body was similarly transformed and was then at its second level of perfection. During the Earth phase, the I was incorporated into our human predecessors, who consisted of physical, etheric, and astral bodies at that point. Through this process, the physical body achieved its fourth level of perfection, the life body its third, and the astral body its second, while the I is still only in its first stage of existence. If we can devote ourselves to taking an unbiased look at the human being, we will have no difficulty imagining these elements as different degrees of perfection in the right way. All we need to do is to compare the physical body with the astral body in this respect. Obviously, the astral body, as a soul component, is at a higher level of evolution than the physical body, and in future, when it has been perfected, it will be much more significant for our overall makeup than the present physical body. In its own way, however, the physical body has reached a certain climax in its evolution. Just think of the structure of the heart, which is organized in harmony with the greatest possible wisdom, or of the wonderful construction of the brain, or even of a single part of a bone, such as the upper end of the thigh bone. Within the end of this bone we find a regularly structured network or trellis-like pattern of delicate rods. The whole thing is arranged so as to yield the best possible results for the surface of the joint, for example, the best distribution of friction, so that it achieves the right kind of mobility while using as little material as possible. We find wisdom-filled arrangements such as this in all parts of the physical body. And if we then go on to observe the harmonious interaction between the parts and the whole, we will certainly agree that this member of our human makeup is complete and perfect in its own way. Any apparent ineffectiveness in certain parts of the body or disturbances in its structure or functioning seem unimportant in comparison. We will even discover that in a certain respect, such disturbances are only the necessary shadow side of the wisdom-filled light that illumines our entire physical organism. Now let's compare this to the astral body as the vehicle of our pleasure and pain, desires and passions. What insecurity prevails there with regard to joy and sorrow? What frequently meaningless desires and passions are played out, often running counter to our higher aims? The astral body is only beginning to achieve the harmony and internal consistency that we already find in the physical body. Similarly, it is possible to show that the ether body, although more perfect in its own way than the astral body, is less perfect than the physical body. If we consider the I in the right way, it will also become evident that it is currently only at the very beginning of its evolution. To what extent, for example, has it already accomplished its task of transforming the other components of our makeup into manifestations of its own nature? For those familiar with spiritual science, the results of outer observations in this area are underscored by something else. We might point out that the physical body is subject to illness, but spiritual science is in a position to demonstrate that a great percentage of all illness originates in errors and aberrations of the astral body that destroy the perfect harmony of the physical body in a roundabout way, through being transmitted to the ether body. Both this deeper connection, which can only be touched on here, and the actual reason for many disease processes elude any scientific method of observation that chooses to confine itself to physical sense-perceptible facts. Since, in most cases, this connection results in damage to the astral body that does not produce pathologies in the physical body during the lifetime in which this damage occurs, but only in the following one, the laws governing this process are meaningful only for those who acknowledge the existence of repeated human lives. But even if we do not choose to acquire this deeper knowledge, looking at life in the usual way will also show us that human beings indulge in far too many gratifications and desires that undermine the harmony of the physical body. And gratification, desire, passion, and so on have their seat in the astral body rather than in the physical body. In many respects, the astral body is still imperfect enough to destroy the perfection of the physical body. It should be pointed out again, at this point, that discussing these things does not constitute an attempt to prove spiritual scientific statements about the evolution of the four members of our human makeup. Any proof is taken from spiritual research itself, which shows that the physical body has undergone 4 transformations toward higher degrees of perfection, while our other members have undergone fewer, as already described. Here, we are simply attempting to show that spiritual research communicates facts whose effects are also evident in the varying degrees of perfection of the physical body, life body, and so on, and that these different levels of perfection are also outwardly perceptible. The end of the first part of chapter 4 up to, but not including, paragraph 17, which is where the Saturn phase description proper starts. This is chapter 4 of An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Steiner. This is the second part. I'm beginning with his description of Saturn, paragraph 17, on page 135 of the Classics and Anthroposophy text. If we want to form an approximately accurate idea of conditions during the Saturn phase of evolution, we must consider the fact that during that period none of the things and creatures currently belonging to the earth and its mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms were present as such. The beings of these 3 kingdoms developed only during later evolutionary periods. Of all the earthly beings that are now physically perceptible, human beings were the only ones existing at that time. And of these human beings, the physical body was the only part already present, as described above. However, the beings of the mineral, plant, animal, and human kingdoms are not the only beings that belong to the earth at present. There are also other beings that do not reveal themselves in physical bodies. Such beings were also present during the Saturn phase of evolution, and their activity in this Saturn setting resulted in the later evolution of human beings. In looking at the middle evolutionary period of the Saturn incarnation, although not at its beginning or end, spiritual perception can discern a state consisting primarily of warmth. No gaseous, liquid, or solid elements are to be found. These all appear only in later incarnations. Let's imagine that human beings with present-day sense organs were to approach this Saturn world as observers. With the exception of the sensation of warmth, they would experience none of the sensory impressions humans can have. On entering the space occupied by Saturn, they would perceive only that its condition of warmth is different from the rest of the surrounding space. However, they would discover that this space is not uniformly warm throughout, but has warmer and colder areas that alternate in a great variety of patterns. Warmth would be perceived radiating along certain lines that are not straight, but form irregular shapes produced by variations in heat. Our observers would be confronted by something like a structured cosmic being that appears in constantly changing states and consists only of heat. It is difficult for modern individuals to imagine something that consists only of warmth, since we are accustomed to perceiving warmth only in association with hot or cold, gaseous, liquid, or solid bodies, rather than thinking of it as something in itself. Especially those of us who have absorbed the ideas of modern physics will find it ridiculous to talk about warmth or heat in the way just described, and we might say this: while there are solid, liquid, and gaseous bodies, heat only indicates a condition of one of these three types. When the smallest particles of a gas are in motion, this motion is perceived as heat, so where there is no gas there can be no such movement and therefore no heat. Spiritual scientific researchers see this subject in a quite different light. For them, heat is something that they can speak of in the same sense that they speak of a gas, a liquid, or a solid body. It is a substance still more delicate than a gas, and a gas is nothing other than condensed heat in the same sense that a liquid is a condensed vapor or a solid a condensed liquid. So spiritual scientists speak of bodies of heat, just as they also speak of bodies of gas or vapor. In order to follow spiritual researchers into this domain, it is only necessary to admit that soul perception is possible. In the world that is presented to our physical senses, heat certainly does exist as a condition of solids, liquids, and gases. However, this is only an external aspect or effect of heat. Physicists speak only about heat's effect, not about its inner nature. Let's try to disregard all the effects of heat we receive through external objects and simply picture the inner experience we have when we say, quote, "I feel warm," unquote, or, quote, "I feel cold," unquote. Only this inner experience can give us an idea of what Saturn was like in the evolutionary period described above. We would have been able to run right through the space it occupied. There would have been no gas to exert any pressure, no solid or liquid bodies to reflect any impressions of light. But at every point within this space, we would have had the inner feeling of a particular degree of warmth, yet without receiving any impression from outside. Conditions in a cosmic body like this are not suitable for the animals, plants, and minerals of the present time. It should therefore hardly be necessary to say that what was described above could never actually take place. It is not possible for a modern human being, as such, to actually confront old Saturn as an observer. The description was only intended as an illustration. The beings that supersensible perception becomes aware of while observing Saturn are at a very different stage of evolution than present-day sense-perceptible earthly beings. The first beings to appear to this supersensible perception do not have physical bodies like those of present-day human beings. When we speak of a physical body in this context, we must be careful to avoid thinking about human physical bodies as they exist today. Rather, we must distinguish carefully between the physical body and the mineral body. A physical body is one that is governed by the physical laws we observe today in the mineral kingdom. However, our present-day physical bodies are not only governed by such physical laws, but are also imbued with mineral substance. There can be no talk of physical mineral bodies like this on Saturn. The physical corporeality that existed on Saturn was governed by physical laws, but these laws expressed themselves only in the effects of warmth. So the physical body was a delicate, ethereal body of heat. All of Saturn consisted of warmth bodies like this, which laid the first foundations for present-day physical mineral human bodies. Our present bodies developed when the gaseous, liquid, and solid states of matter that later came into existence were incorporated into these warmth bodies. Among the other non-human beings perceived by supersensible consciousness, when it becomes aware of the Saturn state, there are some, for example, who have no need for a physical body. The lowest component of their makeup is an ether body. In addition, however, they have a part that is higher than any belonging to human beings. The highest member of the human being is the spirit body, but these other beings have something that is higher still. Between the ether body and the spirit body, they also have all the other components described in this book as belonging to human beings: the astral body, the eye, the spirit self, and the life spirit. Saturn, like our Earth, was surrounded by an atmosphere, but instead of being a sphere of air, Saturn's atmosphere was of a spiritual character. To precisely express this inner experience that occurs in spiritual research, instead of saying, quote, Saturn is surrounded by an atmosphere, unquote, we would have to say, quote, while supersensible cognition is becoming aware of Saturn, an atmosphere that belongs to Saturn also presents itself to consciousness, unquote. Similarly, we would have to say, quote, other beings, unquote, or, quote, beings of this sort, unquote, quote, present themselves, unquote. Transforming this into the expression that something is present must be permitted, because this also takes place in the expressions we use for actual soul experience in the case of sensory perception. This is evident from the context of the discussion. However, it must be kept in mind in reading the descriptions that follow. Saturn consisted entirely of beings, those just described and still others. There was a constant interaction between the warmth bodies on Saturn and these beings, who allowed the elements of their makeup to sink down into Saturn's physical warmth bodies. So, while there was no life in these warmth bodies themselves, the life of their surroundings was expressed in them. They could be compared to mirrors, but instead of reflecting images of the beings in question, they reflected their state of life. We would not have been able to discover anything living on Saturn itself, and yet Saturn had an enlivening effect on the surrounding celestial space, because like an echo, it radiated back the life sent down to it. Saturn seemed like one big mirror of celestial life. Certain exalted beings whose life was reflected by Saturn may be called the spirits of wisdom. Parenthesis, in Christian esotericism, they are known as curiotities or dominions. Parenthesis. Their activity on Saturn did not begin with the middle evolutionary period described above. In fact, in a certain sense, it had already come to an end by then. Before they could become conscious of how the warmth bodies of Saturn were reflecting their own life, the spirits of wisdom first had to bring these bodies to the point of being able to carry out this reflecting process. For this reason, their activity commenced shortly after the beginning of the Saturn phase of evolution, when Saturn's bodily nature still consisted of chaotic substance that would not have been capable of reflecting anything. In observing this chaotic substance, we are making use of spiritual perception to transport ourselves back to the beginning of the Saturn phase. What can be observed at this point has not yet acquired the character of heat that it will later possess. In trying to characterize it, we can only speak of a quality that can be compared to human willing. It is will, and only will, through and through. At this point, therefore, we are dealing with a state that is all soul. If we trace this element of will back to its source, we find that it originally emanated from certain exalted beings. Through stages we can only guess at, these beings had brought their evolution to the point where, at the beginning of the Saturn phase, they could pour forth will out of their own essence. After they had been doing this for some time, the activity of the above-mentioned spirits of wisdom united with this outpouring of will. Thus, this will, previously wholly without attributes, gradually acquired the ability to reflect life back into celestial space. The beings who experienced bliss in pouring forth will out of themselves at the beginning of the Saturn phase of evolution can be called spirits of will. Parenthesis, in Christian esotericism, they are called thrones. Parenthesis. After a certain stage in Saturn's evolution had been reached, through this interaction between will and life, other beings present in Saturn's surroundings became active. They can be called spirits of motion, the Christian dynamis, or virtues. They have no physical body and no life body. Their lowest element is the astral body. Once the Saturn bodies had acquired the ability to reflect life, this reflected life was ready to be imbued with characteristics that had their seat in the astral bodies of the spirits of motion. As a result, it seemed as if feelings, manifestations of sensation, and other soul forces were being hurled outward from Saturn into celestial space. Saturn, as a totality, appeared to be an ensouled being, demonstrating sympathies and antipathies. However, these manifestations of soul were certainly not its own. It was only flinging back soul activities belonging to the spirits of motion. After this had been going on for some time, still other beings, which can be called the spirits of form, became active. Their lowest part was also an astral body, but it was at a different stage of evolution than that of the spirits of motion. Whereas the spirits of motion imparted only general expressions of sensation to the life Saturn was reflecting, the astral activity of the spirits of form, parenthesis, the Christian exousiae or powers, parenthesis, was such that their expressions of sensation were flung out into space as though from individual beings. It could be said that the spirits of motion allowed Saturn as a whole to appear as an ensouled being, while the spirits of form divided this life into individual living beings, so that Saturn then appeared as a conglomerate of soul beings. To get a picture of this, imagine how a mulberry or a blackberry is made up of small individual fruits. To those with supersensible perception, Saturn at this period in its evolution was likewise made up of individual Saturn beings, which, although they did not yet possess individual lives and souls, reflected the lives and souls of the beings that lived in them. In the next order of beings to intervene in this state of Saturn, the astral body was also the lowest element, but these beings had brought the astral body to a stage of development where it functioned like a present-day human eye. Through these beings, the eye looked down upon Saturn from its surroundings and conveyed its own nature to Saturn's individual living beings. As a result, what was sent out from Saturn into space appeared similar to the activity of human personalities in our present cycle of life. The beings bringing this about may be called the spirits of personality, the Christian archai, or principalities. They granted a semblance of the character of personality to the little Saturn bodies. However, personality as such did not exist on Saturn, but only its reflection, as it were, an empty shell of personality. The spirits of personality had their real personality out in the periphery, in Saturn's surroundings. The delicate substance described earlier as heat was bestowed on the Saturn bodies through the fact that the spirits of personality allowed their essence to be reflected back by these bodies in the way that has been described. There was no inwardness in anything on Saturn, but the spirits of personality recognized the image of their own inwardness as it streamed back to them from Saturn in the form of heat. While all this was going on, the spirits of personality were at the level of present-day human beings. They were going through their human phase. If we want to take an unbiased look at this state of affairs, we must imagine that a being can be, quote-unquote, human in a form different from the form we presently possess. The spirits of personality were human on Saturn. Their lowest component was not the physical body, but the astral body with the eye. Although they had no physical or ether body, such as ours, in which to express the astral body's experiences, they not only possessed the eye, but were also aware of it, because the heat of Saturn made them conscious of it, by reflecting it back to them. They were human beings, under circumstances different from those of Earth. The events in the further course of Saturn's evolution were different in character from the previous ones. Previously, everything had been a reflection of outer life and sensation, but at this point an inner life of a sort began. Here and there, within the Saturn world, light began to stir, flaring up and then darkening again. Flickers and glimmers of light appeared in some places, while in others lightning-like flashes appeared. Saturn's warmth bodies started to flicker and glow and eventually to shine. The fact that this stage of evolution had been reached made it possible once again for certain beings to become active. These beings can be called spirits of fire, the Christian archangeloi, or archangels. They did have astral bodies, but at that stage of their existence, they were unable to stimulate them by themselves. They would have had no feeling or sensation if they had not been able to work on the warmth bodies that had reached the Saturn stage that has just been described. Acting on these bodies gave the spirits of fire the possibility of recognizing their own existence through the influence they exerted. They could not say to themselves, "I exist," but only something like, "My surroundings permit me to exist." They did perceive, and their perceptions consisted of the activities of light on Saturn that have been described above. These are, in a certain sense, their I. This granted these beings consciousness of a very particular sort that can be described as pictorial consciousness. We can imagine it as similar in nature to human dream consciousness, but it possessed a much greater degree of vitality than our dreaming does, and we must realize that its images were no mere insubstantial dream images surging in and out, but bore an actual relationship to Saturn's stirrings of light. In this interplay between the spirits of fire and Saturn's warmth bodies, the germinal form of human sense organs were incorporated into evolution. Let me read that again. In this interplay between the spirits of fire and Saturn's warmth bodies, the germinal form of human sense organs were incorporated into evolution. We see the first glimmering, the first delicate ethereal beginning of the organs we currently use to perceive the physical world. Phantom human beings who at this point exhibit only light archetypes of sense organs are recognizable to clairvoyant perception within the Saturn world. Footnote: regarding the nature and development of human perception and the sense organs, see Rudolf Штайнер, Anthroposophy of Fragment, A New Foundation for the Study of Human Nature, Anthroposophic Press, Hudson, New York, 1996. Regarding the phantom, see, for example, Rudolf Штайнер, From Jesus to Christ, Rudolf Steiner Press, London, 1991, Lecture 6. Quote, the physical forces and substances laid aside at death are not the whole physical body, because its complete configuration could never derive from them alone. Something else belongs to these substances and forces, which is best called the phantom of the human being. This phantom is the form shape that, as a spiritual texture, builds up the physical substances and forces so that they fill out the form we encounter as a human being on the physical plane, unquote, page 113, end footnote. Sense organs, therefore, are the fruit of the activity of the spirits of fire. But these spirits were not the only ones involved in bringing these organs about. At the same time, other beings entered the field of Saturn. These beings were so far advanced in their evolution that they were able to use these embryonic senses to perceive the cosmic events taking place in life on Saturn. These beings may be called the spirits of love, the Christian seraphim. Without them, the spirits of fire could not have had the consciousness described above. The spirits of love looked at events on Saturn with a consciousness that enabled them to convey these events in image form to the spirits of fire. They themselves renounced any benefits, any gratification or pleasure that they might have derived from perceiving events on Saturn. They renounced all this so that the spirits of fire could have it. These events were followed by a new period in Saturn's existence. Something else was added to the stirrings of light. It may seem sheer folly to many when we speak of what then reveals itself to supersensible cognition. Saturn's interior was like surging, intermingling sensations of taste. Sweet, bitter, sour, and so on, could be observed at various points within Saturn, while outwardly all of this reverberated into celestial space as sound, and was perceived as music of a sort. Once again, certain beings found it possible to become active in these processes taking place on Saturn. We will call them sons of twilight, or sons of life. The Christian angeloi, or angels. They interacted with the surging forces of taste that were present in Saturn's interior. Through this, their ether body or life body became active in a way that can be described as a type of metabolism. They brought life into Saturn's interior, and processes of nutrition and elimination began to take place there. The activity of these beings brought about these processes indirectly rather than directly. This internal life made it possible for still other beings to enter, beings who can be called spirits of harmony, the Christian cherubim. They transmitted a dim type of consciousness to the sons of life. It was even dimmer and more dusk-like than our present-day dream consciousness, similar to our consciousness during dreamless sleep, which is of such a low order that we never become conscious of it at all, so to speak. Nonetheless, it is present. It is different from our day consciousness in kind as well as in degree. At present, plants also have this dreamless sleep consciousness. Although it does not convey perceptions of an outer world in the human sense, it does regulate the life processes and bring them into harmony with the processes of the outer cosmos. At the Saturn stage in question, the sons of life were not able to perceive this regulating process, but the spirits of harmony did perceive it and were therefore the actual regulators. All this life activity was played out in phantom human beings described earlier. As a result, spiritual sight perceived them as enlivened. Their life was only a semblance of life, however. It actually belonged to the sons of life, who made use of these phantom human beings, as it were, in order to express their own life. Now let's turn our attention to these phantom humans with their semblance of life. During the Saturn period described, their forms were ever changing, resembling now this figure, now that. As they continued to evolve, these forms became more defined and lasted somewhat longer as they began to be imbued with the effects of spirits that we have already mentioned with regard to the beginning of the Saturn phase of evolution, namely the spirits of will, or thrones. As a result, these phantom humans themselves appeared with the simplest, dullest form of consciousness. We must imagine this consciousness as even duller than that of dreamless sleep. Under present conditions, minerals have this form of consciousness, which brings the inner being into harmony with the outer physical world. On Saturn, the spirits of will regulated this harmony. As a result, human beings appeared as reproductions of the life of Saturn itself. What Saturn was on a large scale, human beings were on a small scale. This provided the initial nucleus of something that is still only in a seminal state in present-day human beings, namely the spirit body, or Atma. Within Saturn, the dull will of these ancient human beings was evident to supersensible perception through effects that can be compared to smells. What manifested outwardly, moving out into celestial space, was somewhat similar to a personality, but instead of being directed by an internal eye, it was regulated from outside like a machine. The regulating agents were the spirits of will. If we survey the descriptions above, it becomes evident that starting from the middle stage of the Saturn phase described first, the stages of this evolutionary phase can be characterized by comparing their effects to present-day sense impressions. We said that the Saturn phase manifested first as heat, followed by stirrings of light, and then by stirrings of taste and sound. Finally, something arose that revealed itself within Saturn like sensations of smell, and on the outside like a mechanically acting human eye. What were Saturn's manifestations prior to the state of warmth? What had existed before that cannot be compared to anything accessible to outer sensory perception. Saturn's warmth state was preceded by a state that we now experience only in our inner being. If we give ourselves up to ideas that we form If we give ourselves up to ideas that we form voluntarily in our souls, without being impelled to do so by outer impressions, we have within us something that no physical senses can perceive, something that can only be perceived by higher sight. Saturn's warmth state was preceded by manifestations that exist only for those who perceive supersensibly. We can list 3 such states: pure soul warmth, that is not outwardly perceptible; pure spiritual light, that is darkness for everything outside; and finally a state of spiritual essence that is complete in itself and needs no external being in order to become conscious of itself. Pure inner warmth accompanies the appearance of the spirits of motion. Pure spiritual light, the spirits of wisdom. Pure inner essence is connected to the first outpourings of the spirits of will. With the appearance of Saturn's warmth, therefore, our evolution made the step from a purely spiritual inner life to an existence that manifested outwardly. It will be especially difficult, no doubt, for present-day consciousness to accept the statement that what we call, quote-unquote, time first appeared during Saturn's warmth stage, since preceding states were not temporal at all, but belonged to a domain that spiritual science can call, quote-unquote, duration. Therefore, it must be understood that all references in this book to temporal relationships with regard to conditions in the, quote, domain of duration, unquote, are used only as comparisons and aids to understanding. In fact, what precedes time can only be described in human language by using expressions that include the concept of time. So we must be aware that although the first, second, and third Saturn periods really did not take place, quote, one after the other, unquote, in the present meaning of the phrase, we cannot avoid describing them in succession. And in spite of their duration or simultaneity, they were dependent on each other in a way that actually can be compared to a sequence in time. Pointing to Saturn's first evolutionary states also sheds light on all further questions about where these states came from. From a purely intellectual standpoint, of course, it is entirely possible to inquire about the origin of any origin, and so on, but this won't do when we are faced with facts. An illustration is enough to make this clear. If we find tracks on a road somewhere, we can ask where they came from. The answer may be, from a wagon. We can then continue asking, where did the wagon come from, and where did it go? Again, it is possible to give an answer based on facts. We can then still ask, who is sitting in the wagon? What were that person's intentions, and what did he or she do? Eventually, however, we get to a point where the facts put an end to the questioning quite naturally. If we continue questioning after that, we are getting away from the purpose of the original question and simply go on asking questions mechanically. In instances such as the one just cited for purposes of comparison, it is easy to tell where the facts put an end to the questioning. This is not so easy when it comes to great questions about the cosmos. If we look closely, however, we will still be able to see that all questions of where things came from must end in the Saturn states described above, because there we come to a place where beings and processes derive their justification from themselves rather than from their origins. As a result of the Saturn phase of evolution, germinal human beings evolved to a certain stage, reaching the low-grade, dull consciousness we talked about earlier. We must not imagine that it began to develop only in the last Saturn period. The spirits of will worked during all of Saturn's stages. But to supersensible perception, the result of their activity is most conspicuous in the last period. There is no fixed dividing line between the activities and effects of the different groups of beings. When it is said that the spirits of will were active first and then the spirits of wisdom, that does not mean that they were active only at that time. They were active throughout the entire evolution of Saturn, but their activity can be observed best during the period specifically mentioned with regard to each group, when the beings in question took over the leadership, as it were. The entire Saturn phase of evolution, therefore, appears as a reworking of what emanated from the spirits of will by the spirits of wisdom, movement, form, and so on. In this process, these spiritual beings were also undergoing an evolution of their own. For example, after having their life reflected back to them from Saturn, the spirits of wisdom were at a different level than they were before. The fruits of their activity enhanced their own intrinsic capabilities. As a result, when the activity was completed, something similar to human sleep set in for them. The periods when their activity was directed toward Saturn were followed by periods when they lived in other worlds, so to speak, and their activity was turned away from Saturn. Therefore, clairvoyant perception sees an ascent and a descent in the Saturn evolution described above. The ascent continued until the state of warmth had been formed. With the first stirrings of light, the ebbing had already begun. By the time phantom human beings had acquired form through the spirits of will, the spiritual beings had gradually withdrawn. The Saturn phase of evolution died away and disappeared as such, and a period of rest set in. It was as if the incipient human beings entered a state of dissolution, not one in which they disappeared, but one similar to what happens to the seed of a plant, which rests in the earth as it prepares to mature into a new plant. Similarly, germinal human beings rested in the bosom of the cosmos and awaited a new awakening. When the time came for these germinal human beings to awaken, the spiritual beings described above had acquired, under different circumstances, the capacity to work on them once more. The ether bodies of the spirits of wisdom had acquired a capacity not only for enjoying the reflection of life as they did on Saturn, but also for allowing life to stream out from themselves, endowing other beings. At this point, the spirits of motion were as far advanced as the spirits of wisdom had been on Saturn. Previously, the lowest member in their makeup had been the astral body, but then they acquired the ether body or life body. The other spiritual beings, too, had arrived at correspondingly higher levels of evolution and could therefore work differently to evolve the germinal human beings than they could on Saturn. However, the germinal human beings had dissolved at the end of the Saturn evolutionary phase. In order for the spiritual beings who had evolved further to pick up where they had left off, the germinal human beings first had to briefly recapitulate what they had gone through on Saturn. Parenthesis, this is visible to supersensible perception. Parenthesis. Incipient human beings emerged from concealment and began to develop their own Let me read that again. Incipient human beings emerged from concealment and began to develop through their own capacity, through forces that had been implanted in them on Saturn. They emerged from the darkness as beings of will and advanced through the stages of seeming alive and seeming ensouled to the mechanical manifestation of personality they had possessed at the end of the Saturn phase. That's the end of paragraph 29. I am on page 153 of the book, the beginning of the sun description. That's the end of this section. This is the next section, the third section of chapter 4, An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Steiner, beginning on paragraph 30 with the description of the sun condition. The second of the great evolutionary phases we mentioned, the sun stage, raised human beings to a higher state of consciousness than had been achieved on Saturn. Although in comparison to our present-day consciousness, this sun state might well be described as unconsciousness, since it approximates the state we now find ourselves in during completely dreamless sleep. Or we could also compare it to the low-grade consciousness in which the present-day plant world slumbers. To supersensible perception, there is no such thing as unconsciousness, only various degrees of consciousness. Everything in the world is conscious. In the course of the sun phase of evolution, the human essence attained a higher degree of consciousness because the etheric body or life body was incorporated into its makeup. Before this could happen, the Saturn stages had to be recapitulated as described earlier. This recapitulation had a very specific purpose. Once the period of rest came to an end, the former Saturn emerged from cosmic sleep, in quotes, as a new cosmic being, as the sun. But as a result, the circumstances of evolution had changed. The spiritual beings whose activity on Saturn had been described The spiritual beings whose activity on Saturn has been described had moved on to different states of being. To begin with, however, germinal human beings appeared on the newly formed sun just as they were at the end of the Saturn phase. They first had to transform the various stages of development they went through on Saturn, so that these stages would correspond to circumstances on the sun. For this reason, the Sun phase began with a repetition of events on Saturn, adapting them to the changed circumstances of the Sun's life. When human beings had gone far enough in adapting the level of development it had acquired on Saturn to the Sun's circumstances, the spirits of wisdom mentioned earlier began to allow the etheric body or life body to stream into the physical body. The higher level that human beings achieved on the Sun can be characterized by saying that the physical body, already seminally formed on Saturn, was lifted to a second level of perfection by becoming the vehicle for an etheric or life body. This etheric body or life body itself achieved its first level of perfection during the Sun phase of evolution. In order for the physical body to reach its second level of perfection, and the life body its first, however, still other spiritual beings had to intervene during the further course of the Sun's life, just as was already described with regard to the Saturn phase. When the spirits of wisdom began to pour the life body into the germinal human beings, the Sun, dark until then, began to shine. With the life body, the first signs of inner vitality also entered the germinal human being. Life began. What still had to be described as a mere semblance of life on Saturn then became actual life. The period of pouring the life body into the human being lasted for a certain length of time, after which an important change took place in the germinal human being. It separated into two parts. Whereas previously the physical body and the life body were intimately connected and formed a whole, at this point the physical body began to detach itself as a separate part. However, it also continued to be permeated by the life body. Now we are dealing with a twofold human being. One part is a physical body permeated by a life body working within it. The other part is pure life body. This separation, however, took place during a rest period in the life of the Sun. During this period, the shining that had already begun was extinguished, and the separation took place during a cosmic night, as it were. However, this interval of rest was much shorter than the above-mentioned one between the Saturn and Sun phases. Once this rest period was over, the spirits of wisdom continued to work for a time on the twofold human being, just as they had formerly worked on the unitary human being. Then the spirits of motion began their activity. They suffused the human life body with their own astral body. Within the physical body, the human life body then acquired the ability to carry out certain inner movements that can be compared to the movements of sap in a present-day plant. Bodies on Saturn had consisted solely of heat substance. During the Sun phase of evolution, this heat substance condensed into a state that can be compared to the present state of gas or vapor, a state that can be described as air. The first beginnings of this state became evident after the spirits of motion had begun their activity. The following scene presents itself to supersensible consciousness. Within the substance of heat, something resembling delicate structures appeared and began to make rhythmical movements by means of the forces of the life body. These structures represented the human entity's physical body at that stage of evolution. They were totally permeated with warmth and wrapped in a mantle of warmth. Physically speaking, we can call them warmth structures that incorporated regularly moving shapes of air. If we want to retain the earlier comparison to the present-day plant, we must keep in mind that we are not dealing with a compact plant formation, but with a gaseous or airy structure whose movements are comparable to the movements of sap in the present-day plant. This gaseous or airy substance becomes visible to supersensible consciousness through the effect of the light that it emits. So we could also speak of figures of light that present themselves to spiritual vision. The evolution we have characterized then continued. After a certain time, another rest period ensued, after which the spirits of motion continued their activity until it was supplemented by that of the spirits of form, whose effect was to allow the formerly constantly changing gaseous shapes to assume permanent forms. This also took place through the fact that the spirits of form allowed their forces to flow in and out of the human life body. Previously, when only the spirits of motion were working on them, the gaseous shapes were in constant motion, retaining their form only for an instant. At this point, however, they took on temporarily distinguishable forms. After a certain length of time, a rest period again ensued, after which the spirits of form resumed their activity. Then, however, entirely new conditions appeared within the sun's evolution. We have reached the midpoint of the sun phase of evolution. This is the time when the spirits of personality, who had reached the human stage on Saturn, transcended this stage and rose to a higher level of perfection. They acquired a consciousness that present-day human beings have not yet acquired in the ordinary course of evolution. We will acquire it when the Earth, that is the fourth of the planetary stages of evolution, arrives at its goal and enters the next planetary phase. Then we will not only perceive what our senses convey to us about our surroundings, but will also be capable of perceiving in image form the inner soul states of the beings around us. We will possess pictorial consciousness while retaining full self-awareness. There will be nothing dreamlike or dull in the pictures we see. We will perceive the soul element in images, but in images that express realities, in the same way that physical colors and sounds do now. At present, we can only rise to this kind of vision through spiritual scientific training, which will be discussed later on in this book. Midway through the sun phase, the spirits of personality acquired this vision as a gift of their normal evolution. It made them capable of working on the newly formed human entity's life body in a way that was similar to how they had worked on the physical body during the Saturn phase, when warmth reflected their own personality back at them. At this point, the gaseous shapes were reflecting the images of these beings' pictorial consciousness back at them in resplendent light. They beheld supersensibly what was taking place on the sun, and their vision was no mere observing. It was as if something of the power that human beings call, quote-unquote, love, were asserting itself in the images that streamed toward them from the sun. If we observe this more closely with our soul powers, we discover the reason for this phenomenon. Exalted beings were mingling their activity with the light streaming out from the sun. These were the spirits of love, the Christian seraphim that were mentioned earlier. From this point onward, they acted on the human etheric body or life body along with the spirits of personality. This activity caused the life body itself to advance one stage further in its course of evolution. It acquired the ability not only to transform the gaseous shapes within it, but also to adapt them so that the first signs of reproduction appeared in the living human being. Secretions were driven out of the gaseous structures, sweated out, so to speak, and assumed forms similar to their maternal structures. In characterizing the sun's further evolution, we must point to a fact that is all important in cosmic evolution, namely, that not all beings reach their goals in the course of an evolutionary epoch. Some fall short of their goal. Thus, during the Saturn phase, not all the spirits of personality actually reached the intended human level that was described earlier. Likewise, not every human physical body that developed on Saturn attained the degree of maturity necessary to become the vehicle of an independent life body on the sun. As a result, there were beings and formations on the sun that were not adapted to the circumstances there, and had to use the sun phase to make up for what they had missed on Saturn. Therefore, spiritual observation of the sun stage shows that when the spirits of wisdom began pouring into the life body, the body of the sun grew dark, as it were. intermingled in it were formations that would actually still have belonged to Saturn. These were warmth structures that were not able to condense into air in the right way. Human beings who had remained behind at the Saturn stage. They could not become vehicles for normally developed life bodies. This Saturn warmth substance that remained behind then divided into two parts on the Sun. One part was sucked up, so to speak, by human bodies and formed a certain internalized lower human nature from then on. This means that human beings on the Sun absorbed something into their bodily nature that actually corresponded to the Saturn phase. Just as the human Saturn bodies had made it possible for the spirits of personality to rise to the human level, this Saturn element in human beings did the same for the spirits of fire on the Sun. They raised themselves to the human level by allowing their forces to stream in and out of this Saturn element, just as the spirits of personality had done on Saturn. This too happened in the middle of the Sun phase of evolution. At this point, the Saturn element in human beings was mature enough so that with its help the spirits of fire, archangeloi, were able to pass through their human stage. Another part of Saturn's warmth substance separated off and achieved an independent existence alongside and among human beings of the Sun phase. It constituted a second kingdom alongside the human kingdom, a kingdom that developed a completely independent but purely physical warmth body on the Sun. Consequently, it did not include independent life bodies that could be worked on by the fully developed spirits of personality in the way described earlier. However, some of the spirits of personality had also remained behind at the Saturn stage, not reaching the level of humanity. A bond of attraction existed between them and the second newly independent Sun kingdom. These spirits, then, had to work on this underdeveloped kingdom in the same way that their more advanced counterparts had worked on the human beings who first developed physical bodies on Saturn. On the Sun itself, however, it was not possible for the underdeveloped spirits of personality to do this, so they withdrew from the body of the Sun and formed a separate and independent cosmic body outside of it. From there, they were able to work back on the beings of the second Sun kingdom. Thus, the single cosmic formation of the former Saturn split into two. From this point on, the Sun had a second cosmic body in its surroundings, a body that constituted a rebirth of Saturn after a fashion, a new Saturn. From there, the quality of personality radiated into the second Sun kingdom. In the second kingdom, we are dealing with beings that had no personality of their own on the Sun itself. However, they reflected the personality of the spirits of personality on the new Saturn back to them. Supersensible consciousness can observe warmth forces at work among the human beings on the Sun, forces that played into the Sun's normal evolution. In these forces we can see the influence of these new Saturn spirits. We must keep in mind that during the middle of the Sun phase, the human being was organized into a physical body and a life body in which the more advanced spirits of personality worked in conjunction with the spirits of love. Part of the underdeveloped Saturn nature, in which the spirits of fire were active, mingled with the physical body. Everything the spirits of fire produced in this Saturn nature must be seen as a precursor of present-day human sense organs. We have seen how the spirits of fire had already worked on rudimentary forms of our senses in the warmth substance on old Saturn, and in what the spirits of personality accomplished in conjunction with the spirits of love, seraphim. We can recognize the seminal stages of our present-day glandular system. However, the work of the spirits of personality dwelling on new Saturn was not exhausted in what was described above. They not only extended their activity to the second Sun kingdom, as has been mentioned, but also created a certain connection between this kingdom and the human senses. the warmth substances of this kingdom flowed in and out through the seminal human senses, enabling human beings on the sun to achieve a certain perception of this lower kingdom that was outside of themselves. Of course, this was only a dim perception, in keeping with the dullness of the Saturn consciousness we talked about earlier. It consisted essentially of various impressions of heat. Everything described here as belonging to the middle of the sun phase of evolution lasted for a certain amount of time, and then another period of rest began. After that, evolution continued along the same lines for a while, until the human ether body was mature enough to permit the beginning of a joint effort between the sons of life, angeloi, and the spirits of harmony, cherubim. Within the human being, manifestations comparable to perceptions of taste, but expressing themselves outwardly as sounds, became apparent to supersensible consciousness. As you recall, we already had to describe something similar with regard to the Saturn phase of evolution. On the sun, however, this development was more inward. It was full of a life that was more independent. In this process, the sons of life achieved the dim pictorial consciousness that the spirits of fire had achieved on Saturn. This was done with the help of the spirits of harmony, cherubim, who actually beheld spiritually what was taking place at that point in the sun's evolution, but renounced all the fruits of this perception, all feeling, for the wisdom-filled images that came about, and allowed these to flow into the dream consciousness of the sons of life in magnificent supernatural disclosures, as it were. In turn, the sons of life worked the figures of these visions of theirs into the human ether body, which could then go on to achieve ever higher levels of development. Once again, a period of rest set in. Once again, everything arose out of cosmic sleep, and after a time, human beings matured to the point where they began to rouse forces of their own. These were the same forces that had streamed into them through the activity of the thrones during the last part of the Saturn phase. These human beings now developed an inner life that presents itself to consciousness in a way comparable to an inner perception of smell. Toward the outside, however, toward celestial space, these human beings revealed themselves as personalities that were not, however, directed by any internal eye, but seemed more like plants, giving the impression of personality. We have already seen machine-like manifestations of personality at the end of the Saturn phase, and just as the initial nucleus of something that is only seminally present even in present-day human beings, namely the spirit body or Atma, developed on Saturn, a similar initial nucleus of the life spirit, Buddhi, was formed on the sun. After all this had been going on for a while, another period of rest ensued, after which, just as in previous similar instances, human activity proceeded for a certain time. The conditions that then set in entailed a new intervention on the part of the spirits of wisdom. Through this, human beings became capable of feeling the first traces of sympathy and antipathy for their surroundings. They still had no real feeling, but they did have a forerunner of feeling, because the inner life activity, whose manifestations might be characterized as perceptions of smell, expressed itself outwardly as a kind of primitive speech. Having inwardly perceived a sympathetic smell or a taste or a glimmer of light, the human being in question expressed this outwardly through a sound. And this also occurred in the appropriate fashion in the case of inwardly unsympathetic sensations. As far as human beings were concerned, the actual purpose of the sun phase of evolution was accomplished through all the processes that have been described. Human beings had achieved a sleep consciousness, a level of consciousness higher than what they had possessed on Saturn. After a while, the point in evolution was reached when the higher beings associated with the sun stage had to move on to other spheres in order to assimilate the potentials they had laid down in themselves through their work on the human being. A major period of rest ensued, like the one that had taken place between the Saturn and Sun phases. Everything that had developed on the sun passed over into a state comparable to that of a plant when its growth forces lie dormant in the seed. Just as these forces of growth come to light again in a new plant, however, all of the sun's life emerged from the womb of the cosmos again when the rest period was over, and a new planetary existence began. We will be able to grasp the significance of this pause, this cosmic sleep, if we direct our spiritual view to one of the orders of beings mentioned above, such as the spirits of wisdom, for example. On Saturn they had not yet advanced to the point of being able to allow an ether body to stream out of them. They only became ready to do so through the experiences they had on Saturn. During the rest period, they transformed what had been prepared in them into actual capacities, so that on the sun they were sufficiently advanced to allow life to stream forth from them, endowing human beings with ether bodies of their own. That is the end of the sun description. The moon now follows, which I will continue on this same recording. Paragraph 38, the beginning of moon. After the rest period, what had formerly been the sun emerged from cosmic sleep. That is, it became perceptible to the forces of spiritual vision once again, as it had been before becoming invisible during the rest period. However, a twofold aspect then appeared in the newly emerging planetary being that will be called the moon, not to be confused with the part of it that is the moon, Earth's moon at present. The first thing we must note is that what had separated off during the sun phase as new Saturn had been reabsorbed into this new planetary being. That is, new Saturn had reunited with the sun during the period of rest. To begin with, everything that had been present in the first Saturn reappeared as a single cosmic formation. The second thing we must note is that during the period of rest, the human life bodies that had developed on the sun had been absorbed by something that constituted a certain spiritual covering for the planet. At this point, therefore, these life bodies did not appear in union with the corresponding physical human bodies, which appeared separately for the time being. Although these physical bodies carried with them everything that had been created in them on Saturn and Sun, they lacked ether bodies or life bodies. They were not able to absorb ether bodies immediately, because they had not yet adjusted to the evolution these ether bodies had undergone during the rest period. In order to accomplish this adjustment, a repetition of the Saturn state once again took place at the beginning of the moon phase of evolution. Physical human beings again recapitulated the periods of Saturn's evolution, but under totally changed circumstances. On Saturn, as we know, the only forces at work in human beings had been the forces of a warmth body. But at this point, the forces of the gaseous body acquired on the sun were also active. However, they did not appear at the very beginning of the moon phase of evolution, when it was as if human beings consisted only of heat substance, with the gaseous forces lying dormant within them. Then a time came when the first signs of these gaseous forces appeared. Finally, in the last stage of the Saturn recapitulation, human beings again appeared as they had done while in a living state on the sun. Their life, however, again proved to be only a semblance of life. First, a period of rest ensued, similar to the short periods of rest during the sun phase of evolution. Then the influx of the life body into the physical body, which had meanwhile become mature enough to receive it, began again. Like the Saturn recapitulation, this influx took place in 3 distinct epochs. During the second of these epochs, human beings adjusted to the new moon circumstances to the extent that the spirits of motion were able to transform the ability they had acquired into deeds, and were able to allow the astral body to flow out of their own essential nature into the human being. The spirits of motion had prepared themselves for this work during the sun phase, and transformed what they had prepared into the above-mentioned ability during the rest period between the sun and moon incarnations. The influx of the astral body continued for a while, and then one of the shorter rest periods ensued, after which the influx continued until the spirits of form began their activity. The astral body acquired its first soul characteristics through the fact that the spirits of motion were allowing it to stream into human beings. Processes that took place in the astral body because it possessed a life body, processes that had still been plant-like in character during the sun phase of evolution, began to be accompanied by sensation, and the astral body began to experience pleasure and displeasure because of these processes. Until the intervention of the spirits of form, however, this remained an ever-changing inner ebb and flow of pleasure and displeasure. But these ever-changing feelings were at that point transformed in such a way that the first trace of longing and desire appeared in human beings, who then attempted to repeat what had once given them pleasure and to avoid what they had experienced with antipathy. However, since the spirits of form did not surrender their own being to humans, but simply allowed their forces to stream in and out of them, human desires lacked inwardness and independence. They were guided by the spirits of form and appeared instinctive in character. On Saturn, the human physical body was a body of warmth. On the Sun, it condensed into the gaseous state, that is, into air. During the moon phase of evolution, at a certain point when the astral element was streaming in, the physical body achieved a further degree of condensation and entered a state comparable to present-day liquids. We can call this state water, meaning not water as we understand it today, but any fluid form of existence. The human physical body then gradually assumed a form consisting of 3 structures composed of different states of matter. The densest, a water body, had currents of air running through it, and both water and air were also permeated by warmth in various manifestations. Once again, not all the bodies that had existed at the sun stage had achieved the full maturity corresponding to that stage. On the moon, therefore, there were some bodies that were only at the Saturn stage, and others that had only reached the sun stage, so 2 other kingdoms came about alongside the kingdom of normally developing human beings. One of these kingdoms consisted of beings that had remained behind at the Saturn stage, and thus had only physical bodies, that were not ready to become vehicles for independent life bodies on the moon. This was the lowest moon kingdom. The second kingdom consisted of beings that had remained behind at the sun stage, and therefore did not become mature enough on the moon to incorporate independent astral bodies. These beings formed an intermediary kingdom between the kingdom just mentioned and the kingdom of normally developing human beings. However, something else also took place. Since substances composed merely of forces of heat and those composed merely of air also permeated human beings at this stage, humans also carried a Saturn and a Sun character within themselves. As a result, a certain rift developed in human nature, calling up something very significant in moon evolution after the activity of the spirits of form began. A cleft started to form in the cosmic body of the moon, and part of its substances and beings separated from the rest. 2 cosmic bodies were formed out of one. One of them became the dwelling place of certain higher beings, who had formerly been more closely linked to the unitary cosmic body. In contrast, the other was occupied by human beings, the 2 lower kingdoms described above, and certain higher beings who did not move over to the first cosmic body. The first cosmic body with its higher beings appeared like a reborn but refined sun, while the other was the actual new formation of this phase, the old moon, in quotes, the third, after Saturn and Sun, planetary incarnation of our Earth. The reborn sun took only warmth and air with it from the substances that had come about on the moon, while the watery element was present on what remained of the moon in addition to these 2 other substances. As a result of this separation, The beings who had departed with the re-emerging sun were not hampered in their further development by the denser moon beings, and were able to proceed unhindered in their own evolution. This made it possible for them to achieve an even greater power in working down on the moon beings from outside, from their sun. In turn, these moon beings also received new evolutionary possibilities. The spirits of form, in particular, had remained united with these moon beings and proceeded to firmly establish the character of their passions and desires. This was gradually expressed in a further condensation of the human physical body. Its formerly merely watery consistency became viscous, and its air and warmth formations become correspondingly denser. Similar processes also took place in the two lower kingdoms. As a result of the separation of the moon body from the sun body, the moon related to the sun in the same way that the Saturn body had once related to the entire surrounding cosmos and its evolution. The Saturn body had been formed out of the body of the spirits of will, or thrones. Its substance reflected back into cosmic space everything experienced by the spiritual beings living in the surroundings, and through events that followed, this reflection gradually awoke to independent life. The basis of all evolution lies in this gradual separation of independent being from the life of its surroundings. As though by reflection, these surroundings then imprint themselves on this separate being, which then continues to evolve independently. The moon body also separated from the sun body in this way, first reflecting back the life of the sun. This is the cosmic process that would have taken place if nothing else had happened. There would have been a sun body, where the beings adapted to it would have experienced certain things in the elements of warmth and air. Opposite this sun body there would have been a moon body, where other beings living in warmth, air, and water would have evolved. The progress from the sun embodiment to the moon would have consisted in the fact that the life of the sun beings was mirrored for them by moon processes, as it were, allowing them to enjoy it in a way that was not possible for them during the sun embodiment. In fact, however, the process of evolution did not continue in this way. Something then happened that was profoundly significant for all subsequent evolution. Certain beings adapted to the moon body took possession of the element of will, the legacy of the thrones, that was available to them, and used it to shape a life of their own, independent of the life of the sun. Alongside moon experiences that were fully under the influence of the sun, other independent moon experiences developed, causing a state of rebellion or revolt against the sun beings. The different kingdoms that had come about on sun and moon, especially the kingdom of incipient human beings, were drawn into this revolt. As a result, the moon body contained two sorts of life, both spiritually and materially speaking. One that was intimately connected to the life of the sun, and one that broke away from all this and went its own independent way. This division into two kinds of life was then expressed in all subsequent events of the moon embodiment. What this evolutionary period presents to supersensible consciousness can be characterized in the images that follow. The entire surface of the moon consisted of a semi-living substance that was sometimes sluggish and sometimes animate in its movement. There was still no mass of minerals in the sense of the rocks and soil we walk around on today. We could say that a kingdom of plant minerals was present. However, we must imagine that the entire surface of the moon consisted of this plant mineral substance, just as the earth now consists of rocks, soil, and so on. Just as nowadays we have towering masses of rock, on the moon there were harder portions comparable to hard, woody structures or horn formations. Just as plants now rise out of the mineral soil, moon soil was covered and permeated by the second kingdom, which consisted of certain plant animals whose substance was softer and more inherently mobile than that of the surface mass. This kingdom spread out over the other one like a viscous sea. Human beings themselves can be described as animal humans whose nature included the components of the two other kingdoms. However, each human being was totally permeated by a life body and an astral body that were worked on by forces emanating from the higher beings on the detached sun. This ennobled the human form. While the spirits of form had given human beings a form that adapted them to life on the moon, the sun spirits made them into beings that transcended that life. They then had the strength to ennoble their own nature by means of the abilities bestowed on them by these spirits. In fact, it was possible for even the aspect of human nature that was related to the lower kingdoms to be raised to a higher level. Perceived spiritually, the processes involved here can be described like this. The predecessors of human beings had been ennobled by beings who had broken away from the sun kingdom. This ennobling process especially affected everything that could be experienced in the element of water, since the sun beings who governed the elements of warmth and air had less influence on this element. For our predecessors, the result of this was that two types of beings exerted influence on their makeup. One part of it was totally imbued with the effects and activities of the sun beings, while the breakaway moon beings worked in the other part, making it more independent than the first. In the first part, the only states of consciousness that could come about were those in which the sun beings lived, while in the second, a type of cosmic consciousness, similar to that of the Saturn state, prevailed, only on a higher level. Our predecessors thus felt themselves to be an image of the cosmos, while their sun portion experienced itself only as an image of the sun. Within human nature, a certain conflict then arose between these two types of beings. It was resolved by the sun beings, making the material organism, which allows independent cosmic consciousness to come about, frail and perishable so that it would need to be cast off from time to time. Let me read that sentence again. It was resolved by the sun beings, making the material organism, which allows independent cosmic consciousness to come about, frail and perishable so that it would need to be cast off from time to time. While shedding this material organism, and for some time afterward, our predecessors were dependent solely on the sun's influence. Their consciousness became less independent, and they surrendered completely to the life of the sun. Their independent moon part was then renewed, and after a while this whole process repeated itself. On the moon, then, our predecessors lived in alternating states of clearer and duller consciousness, accompanied by transformations in the material aspect of their being. From time to time they cast off their moon bodies and put them on again later. Seen physically, great variations appeared in the moon kingdoms described here. The mineral plants, plant animals, and animal humans were differentiated into groups. We can easily understand this if we consider the fact that because certain structures had remained behind at each of the earlier stages of evolution, their forms were endowed with the most varied characteristics. Some still displayed characteristics of the beginning of the Saturn phase, while others were typical of its middle and final periods, and the same was true of all the stages of the sun's evolution. In the cosmic body's evolution through successive planetary incarnations, some of the structures associated with it fell behind, and so did some of the beings involved in its evolution. A number of levels of such beings had already come about in the evolution leading up to the moon. There were spirits of personality who had still not reached their human level on the sun, but there were also others who had caught up to the stage of humanity there. The spirits of fire should have been human on the sun, but a number of them also fell behind. During the sun phase, certain underdeveloped spirits of personality had withdrawn from the main body of the sun to reconstitute Saturn as a separate cosmic body. Similarly, in the course of the moon phase, the beings mentioned above also withdrew to separate cosmic bodies. Up to this point we have only spoken of the separation of sun and moon, but for the reasons described above, still other cosmic formations split off from the moon body that had appeared after the great pause between sun and moon evolutions. After some time a system of cosmic bodies came into existence. It is easy to see that the most advanced of these must be called the new sun, just as a bond of attraction existed between the underdeveloped Saturn kingdoms and the spirits of personality on New Saturn. As described earlier, a similar bond now formed between each of these cosmic bodies and the corresponding moon beings. It would take us too far afield to follow up all these cosmic bodies in detail, so we must be content with indicating why a whole series of cosmic bodies gradually separated from the unitary cosmic formation that appeared as Saturn at the beginning of human evolution. After the spirits of form became active on the moon, evolution continued for a while in the way already described. After this time, a pause again ensued, and the coarser portions of the three moon kingdoms entered a certain state of rest. But the finer portions, specifically human astral bodies, separated from these coarser formations and entered a state in which the higher forces of exalted sun beings were able to work on them especially strongly. When the rest period was over, they re-entered the parts of the human being composed of coarser substances. Through having assimilated these strong forces during the rest period in a state of freedom, they were then able to make these coarser substances mature enough to receive the influence that was soon to be exerted on them by the normally advancing spirits of personality and by the spirits of fire. Meanwhile, these spirits of personality had arisen to the level of consciousness of, in italics, inspiration, where they were not only able to perceive the inner states of other beings in image form, as they did in their earlier pictorial consciousness, but could also perceive the actual inner nature of these beings, as if in a spiritual language of sounds. The spirits of fire, however, had arisen to the level of consciousness occupied by the spirits of personality on the sun. Therefore, both types of spirits were able to intervene in the matured life of human beings. The spirits of personality worked on the astral body, the spirits of fire on the human ether body. This gave the astral body the character of personality. From this point onward, it not only experienced pleasure and pain, but also related them to itself. It did not yet achieve a full I consciousness that would allow it to say, quote-unquote, I exist, but felt that it was being carried and protected by other beings in its surroundings. Looking up to them, it could say, quote, these surroundings of mine maintain my existence, unquote. From this point onward, the spirits of fire worked on the ether body. Under their influence, the movement of forces within this body increasingly became an inner life activity. What happened there found physical expression in the movement of fluids and in phenomena of growth. Since gaseous substances had been condensed into watery ones, it was now possible to speak of a certain process of nourishment, in the sense that what was taken in from outside was transformed and assimilated within. If we think of something halfway between digestion and breathing as we know them now, this will give us an idea of what was going on in this direction. Human beings were taking nourishing substances from the kingdom of the plant animals. We must imagine these plant animals as swimming or floating in, or lightly attached to, the element that surrounded them, just as present-day lower aquatic animals live in water or land animals live in air. However, this element was neither water nor air as we know them now, but something halfway between the two, a kind of dense vapor in which various substances moved to and fro in various currents as if in solution. The plant animals simply seemed to be like regular condensed forms of this element and were frequently only slightly different from their surroundings. Alongside the process of digestion, respiration existed, not as we know it now, but as a process of drawing warmth in and allowing it to stream out again. To supersensible observation, this was as if the organs involved in these processes were opening and closing again, allowing a stream of warmth to flow in and out, and drawing in and expelling gaseous and water-like substances. Because human beings already possessed an astral body at this stage of their evolution, these processes of respiration and digestion were accompanied by feelings, so that a certain pleasure came about when the substances absorbed from outside were favorable to development. Displeasure was aroused when harmful substances flowed in, or even when they appeared nearby. As has already been described, the processes of breathing and digestion were very closely related. Likewise, the process of forming mental images was very close to reproduction. The things and beings in the moon humans' surroundings did not exert a direct effect on senses of any kind. The character of mental image forming was such that the presence of these things and beings stimulated pictures in the dull, dusk-like consciousness of human beings. These images were much more intimately connected with the actual nature of the surroundings than our present-day sense perceptions, which only reveal the outer aspect of things and beings through colors, sounds, odors, and so on. To get a clearer idea of the consciousness of the moon human, let's imagine it as being embedded in the vapor-like surroundings described above. A great variety of processes were taking place in this vapor-like element. Substances were combining and separating. Certain parts were becoming denser, others less dense. All this was taking place in such a way that although human beings did not see or hear the process directly, it did call up images in their consciousness. These images can be compared to those of our present-day dream consciousness. For example, when something falls to the ground, someone who is sleeping does not perceive the actual event, but may imagine that a shot has been fired. However, the images of moon consciousness were not arbitrary like our dream images today. Although they were symbols rather than exact reproductions, they did correspond to outer processes. A particular outer process gave rise to only one specific picture. Moon humans were therefore in a position to adapt their actions to these images, just as we adapt ours to our perceptions. We must keep in mind, however, that our perception-based actions are subject to personal choice, while moon humans, under the influence of such images, were impelled to action by some unclear impetus. This pictorial consciousness made it possible not only to have an image of outer physical processes, but also to picture the spiritual beings and their activities that were in effect behind the physical facts. Thus, the spirits of personality became visible, so to speak, in the objects of the plant-animal kingdom. The spirits of fire appeared in and behind mineral-plant beings. And the sons of life appeared as beings that could be mentally pictured without connection to anything physical, as etheric soul formations, so to speak. Even though the mental images of moon consciousness were symbols rather than exact reproductions of outer things, their effect on the inner human being was much more significant than that of present-day mental images transmitted through perception. They were capable of setting the whole inner being in motion and rousing it to action. Inner processes took shape in accordance with them. They were true formative forces. Human beings became what these formative forces fashioned. They became copies of the processes of their own consciousness, so to speak. That's the end of this part of the reading. I am finishing up, including paragraph 47, about halfway through the moon description. End of this part. This is the third part of chapter 4. This is the fourth section of the reading of the fourth chapter of an outline of esoteric science by Rudolf Steiner. This chapter is called Cosmic Evolution and the Human Being. I am beginning here on paragraph 48 on page 179. The more evolution proceeded in this direction, the more profoundly and incisively human beings changed as a result. Gradually, the force emanating from the images of this consciousness became unable to extend to all of human physical nature, which then divided into two parts that were different in character. Certain elements formed that were subject to the formative influence of this pictorial consciousness. To a great extent, these became a copy of the human image-forming activity described above. Other organs, however, withdrew from this influence. In one part of their being, human beings were too dense, so to speak, too much determined by other laws to act in accordance with the images of consciousness. These images withdrew from human influence, but became subject to that of the exalted sun beings themselves. This stage of evolution, however, was preceded by a period of rest, while the sun spirits summoned the strength to work on moon beings under totally new circumstances. After this rest period, the makeup of the human being was clearly separated into two different aspects. One of them not subject to the independent activity of pictorial consciousness, took on a more definite form and came under the influence of forces which, although emanating from the moon body, came about there only under the influence of the sun beings. This part of the human being participated increasingly in the life inspired by the sun. The second part grew up out of the first part like a kind of head. It was inherently mobile and plastic, taking shape as the expression and vehicle of dimly active human consciousness. These two parts, however, were intimately connected and exchanged fluids with one another. Some of their organs also stretched from one into the other. During the time when all this was happening, a significant harmony was achieved through the development of a relationship between sun and moon that was in line with this evolution. It has already been mentioned that because of their stages of evolution, advancing beings pull their celestial bodies out of the general cosmic mass. See page 151. They radiate the forces, as it were, and the substances separate accordingly. This was how sun and moon separated in order to create the right dwelling places for the corresponding beings. The spirit's role in regulating substance and its forces, however, is much greater than this. The beings involved also determine certain motions of the heavenly bodies, such as how they revolve around each other. Thus these bodies come into varying positions in relation to each other, and when their relative positions change, the effects the corresponding beings have on each other also change. This is what happened with sun and moon. With the beginning of the moon's movement around the sun, there were times when human beings moved more into the influence of the sun's activity, and other times when they were able to turn away from it and be more independent. The moon's movement was the result of certain moon beings breaking away, as described earlier, and of the resolution of the ensuing conflict. It was only the physical expression of the spiritual relationship of forces created by the succession of these beings. The consequence of one celestial body revolving around another is that alternating states of consciousness set in, as described earlier in the beings occupying these bodies. We can say that the moon turned its life alternately toward the sun and away from it. It had a sun period, but also a planetary period when the moon beings developed on the side of it that was turned away from the sun. As far as the moon was concerned, however, something else was involved in addition to the movement of these celestial bodies. Looking back by means of supersensible consciousness, we can see how the moon beings themselves moved around their own cosmic body at regular intervals. At certain times they sought out the places that would expose them to the influence of the sun, while at other times they migrated to places where they would not be subject to this influence and would have the possibility for self-reflection, so to speak. To complete our understanding of the picture that is being drawn of these processes, we must also consider that the sons of life reached their human stage during this time period. On the moon, the human senses, which had already begun in seminal form on Saturn, were still not available for human beings to use for their personal perception of outer objects. At the moon stage, however, these senses became instruments for the sons of life, who made use of them in order to perceive through them. These senses, which belonged to the physical human body, thus entered into a reciprocal relationship with the sons of life, who not only made use of them but also perfected them. As has already been described, a change also took place in the circumstances of human life through human beings changing connections to the sun. Things took shape in such a way that each time human beings became subject to the sun's influence, they became more devoted to the sun and its phenomena than to themselves. At such times they experienced and absorbed, so to speak, the grandeur and glory of the cosmos as expressed in the existence of the sun. In this case, the exalted beings who had their dwelling on the sun were working on the moon, which in turn worked on human beings. However, this influence did not extend to the whole human being, but primarily to the parts that had withdrawn from the influence of personal pictorial consciousness. In particular, the physical body and the life body achieved a certain size and form, but, on the other hand, manifestations of consciousness declined. However, when the life of human beings was turned away from the sun, they were occupied with their own nature. An inner activity began, especially in the astral body, while the outer human figure became less attractive and less perfect in its form. Thus, during the moon phase of evolution, there were two distinctly different, alternating states of consciousness: a duller consciousness during the sun period, and a clearer state during the time when life was left to depend more on itself. The first state was the duller one, but it was also the more selfless. In this state, human beings were more devoted to the outer world, to the cosmos as it was reflected in the sun. This alternation in states of consciousness can be compared both to our present-day alternation between sleep and waking, and to our life between birth and death on the one hand, and our more spiritual existence between death and a new birth on the other. Waking on the moon, as the sun period gradually drew to a close, could be characterized as something halfway between ordinary morning awakening and being born, as we now know them. Similarly, the gradual dimming of consciousness as the sun period approached resembles a state halfway between falling asleep and dying, because on the moon human consciousness of birth and dying was not yet what it is today. During a kind of sun life, human beings gave themselves up to enjoying that life and were withdrawn from their own life for the duration, living more spiritually. It is only possible to attempt an approximate and figurative depiction of what human beings experienced during these times. They felt as if the causative forces of the cosmos were streaming into them and pulsating through them. They felt as if intoxicated with the cosmic harmonies they took part in. During these times, the astral body was as though freed from the physical body, and a part of the life body also withdrew from it. This formation consisted of astral body and life body. Let me read that again. This formation consisting of astral body and life body was like a marvelous, delicate musical instrument, and the mysteries of the universe resounded from its strings. The elements of the physical etheric part of the human being, that was less influenced by consciousness, were shaped according to the harmonies of the universe, because the sun beings were at work in these harmonies. In this way, that part of the human being was shaped by the spiritual tones of the cosmos. At this time, the alternation between clearer and duller states of consciousness was by no means as abrupt as our present-day alternation between waking and deep dreamless sleep, although human pictorial consciousness was not as clear as our present waking consciousness, the other state of consciousness was also not as dull as our present dreamless sleep. Thus human beings did have some idea, although a subdued one, of the play of cosmic harmonies in the physical body and the part of the ether body that had remained united with it. During the time when the sun was not shining on human beings, so to speak, pictorial ideas took the place of these harmonies in the consciousness. In the physical and ether bodies, especially the organs that were directly under the authority of consciousness, flourished during that time. In contrast, the other parts of the human being, which were no longer being worked on by formative forces from the sun, underwent a kind of hardening and desiccating process. When the sun period approached again, the old bodies disintegrated and separated from the human being, who then arose, inwardly reconfigured, if still unsightly, as if from the grave of the old bodily nature. The processes of life had been renewed. Through the workings of the sun beings and their harmonies, the form of the newborn body was then perfected, and the process described above repeated itself. To human beings, this renewal was like putting on new clothes. Their essential nuclei had not passed through an actual birth or death, but had simply shifted from a state of spiritual tone consciousness, where they were devoted to the outer world, to a state of turning inward to a greater extent. They had, quote-unquote, shed their skins. Their old bodies had become unusable, so they were cast off and renewed. This is also a more precise characterization of what was mentioned earlier as a kind of reproduction closely related to the process of mental image forming. Human beings were reproducing their own kind with regard to certain parts of the physical and ether bodies. What came about, however, was not a child totally distinguishable from the parent. Instead, the essential nucleus of the parent being shifted over into the child. The parent being did not produce a new being, but reproduced itself in a new form. This was how moon humans experienced changes in consciousness. When the sun period was approaching, their pictorial ideas grew dimmer and dimmer. They were filled with a blissful sense of surrender, and cosmic harmonies resounded within the stillness of their inner being. Toward the end of this period, the images in their astral bodies were re-enlivened, and they began to feel and sense themselves to a greater extent, experiencing something like an awakening out of the peace and bliss they had been immersed in during the sun period. However, there is still another important experience that appears in this connection. As the images of their consciousness became clear again, human beings had the experience of feeling wrapped in a being-like cloud that had descended from the cosmos. Each of them experienced one such being as complementing and belonging to them personally. It was experienced as an I, as something that granted them their existence. This being was one of the sons of life. The individual human being's feelings for that being were something like this, quote, "Even during the sun period, when I was given over to the glory of the cosmos, I dwelled in this being. It was invisible to me then, but now it is becoming visible." Unquote. These sons of life were also the source of the strength that allowed human beings to work on their own bodily nature during the sunless period. And then, as the sun period approached again, human beings felt themselves becoming one with their sons of life. Although they did not see them then, they still felt intimately connected to them. This connection to the sons of life was such that individual human beings did not each have a personal son of life, but a whole group of human beings experienced one such being as belonging to them. Moon humans lived in separate groups like this, and each group experienced one son of life as their collective I. The difference between groups was made apparent by the fact that the ether bodies of each group's members shared a distinctive form. Since their physical bodies took shape in accordance with their ether bodies, the characteristics of the ether bodies were imprinted on the physical bodies, and the individual groups of human beings appeared as so many different human types. When the sons of life looked down on the groups of human beings belonging to them, they saw multiplications of themselves in these individual human beings. This was their experience of being an I. They were mirrored in human beings, so to speak. This was also the task of the human senses at that time. It has already been shown that these senses did not yet transmit any perceptions of objects. However, they did reflect the essence of the sons of life. What the sons of life perceived through this reflection provided them with their eye consciousness. And in human astral bodies, this reflection aroused the images typical of their dull and dusk-like moon consciousness. The human being's own activity and interaction with the sons of life brought about the first seminal beginnings of the nervous system in the physical body. The nerves represent an extension of the senses into the interior of the human body, as it were. From this description, it can be seen how three types of spirits, the spirits of personality, the spirits of fire, and the sons of life, worked on moon humans. If we look at the main time period in the moon evolutionary phase, its middle period, we can say that this is when the spirits of personality implanted independence and the character of personality in the human astral body. This made human beings capable of turning inward and working formatively on themselves during the times when the sun was not shining on them, so to speak. The spirits of fire were actively at work on the ether body, to the extent that this body imprints the independent form of the human being on itself. These spirits were responsible for human beings feeling that they were still the same beings after each bodily renewal. Thus, through the spirits of fire, the ether body was given memory of a sort. The sons of life worked on the physical body so that it could become the expression of the newly independent astral body. They also made it possible for this physical body to become a physiognomic copy of its astral body. In contrast to this, at times when the physical body and ether body were developing independently of the autonomous astral body during the sun periods, higher spiritual beings intervened in them, specifically the spirits of form and the spirits of motion. They worked down from the sun to accomplish this intervention, as was described above. Human beings matured under the influence of these circumstances, gradually developing in themselves the seminal nucleus of the spirit self. Just as they had developed the nucleus of the spirit body on Saturn and that of the life spirit on the sun. This brought about a change in conditions on the moon. In the transformations and renewals that followed, human beings became ever nobler and more refined, but they also gained in strength. As a result, their image consciousness was increasingly maintained during the sun periods, and began to influence the formation of the physical and etheric bodies, which had formerly been accomplished totally through the activity of the sun beings. What was happening on the moon by means of human beings and the spirits associated with them was becoming increasingly similar to what had formerly been accomplished by the sun and its higher beings. As a result, these sun beings became more and more able to apply their forces to their own development. Because of this, after a certain time passed, the moon became ready to reunite with the sun. Perceived spiritually, these processes appear like this. The breakaway moon beings were gradually overcome by the sun beings, and had to adapt so as to incorporate their undertakings into those of the sun beings to whom they had become subject. However, this happened only after long epochs had gone by, in which the moon periods became ever shorter and the sun periods ever longer. During the evolutionary period that followed, sun and moon were again a single cosmic formation. During this time, the physical human body became completely etheric. Having said this, we must not imagine that we cannot speak of the existence of a physical body in this state. What had been formed as the physical body during the Saturn, Sun, and Moon phases was still present. In this case, it's important to recognize the physical element even when it does not manifest in an outer physical way. The physical element still exists even when it outwardly displays the form of the etheric or even of the astral element. We must simply distinguish between outer appearances and inner laws. It is possible for a physical entity to etherize or astralize, yet still retain its physical laws. This is what happened when the physical human body had reached a certain degree of perfection on the moon. It became ether-like. However, when supersensible consciousness, which can observe things like this, looks at an ether-like body of this sort, this body appears imbued with the laws of the physical element instead of those of the etheric element. In such cases, the physical element has been absorbed into the etheric in order to rest and be cared for there, as if in the womb of a mother. Later, it re-emerges in physical form, but on a higher level. If moon humans had kept their physical bodies in a crudely physical form, the moon would never have been able to reunite with the sun. By assuming an etheric form, the physical body became more closely related to the ether body and could therefore also be more intimately imbued with the parts of the ether and astral bodies that had to withdraw from it during the sun periods of the moon phase of evolution. Human beings who had appeared in the form of dual beings while sun and moon were separated became unified beings again, although their physical element became more soul-like. Their soul element was more united with the physical. These unitary human beings had now entered the immediate sphere of the sun beings, who were then able to work on them in a way that was quite different from when their activity had been directed toward the moon and its human beings from outside. Human beings were now in surroundings that were more soul-like and spiritual in character, which made it possible for the spirits of wisdom to have a significant effect on them, specifically to imprint wisdom on them, to ensoul them with wisdom. This allowed them to become independent souls in a certain sense. The influence of the spirits of wisdom was then augmented by the spirits of motion, who worked primarily on the astral body, which developed a soul-like mobility and a wisdom-filled life body under the influence of these two orders of beings. The wisdom-filled ether body constitutes the first seminal beginnings of what was described in an earlier chapter as the mind soul in present-day human beings, while the astral body, stimulated by the spirits of motion, is the seminal nucleus of the sentient soul. And because all this was brought about when human beings were in a state of heightened independence, these seminal nuclei of the mind and sentient souls appeared as the expression of the spirit self. We must not make the mistake of thinking of the spirit self at this stage in evolution as something independent of the mind and sentient souls. They are only the expression of the spirit self, which signifies their higher unity and harmony. It is especially significant that the spirits of wisdom intervened during this epoch in the way just described. They did so not only with regard to human beings, but also with regard to the other kingdoms that had developed on the moon. When sun and moon were reunited, these lower kingdoms were absorbed into the sphere of the sun, and everything physical about them was etherized. From that point on, therefore, mineral plants and plant animals existed in the sun alongside human beings. However, these other beings remained endowed with laws of their own that made them feel like strangers in their new surroundings. Their character had little in common with that of their environment. Since they had been etherized, however, the effect of the spirits of wisdom was able to extend to them as well. In fact, everything that entered the sphere of the sun from the moon was imbued with the forces of the spirits of wisdom. For this reason, What the sun-moon formation became during this period in evolution can be called the cosmos of wisdom. After a period of rest, our Earth's solar system appeared as the successor to this cosmos of wisdom. When that happened, all the beings that came to life again on Earth, emerging from their moon nuclei, appeared filled with wisdom. This is why we present-day Earth humans, if we observe closely, can discover wisdom in the nature of the things around us. We can admire the wisdom in every leaf of every plant, in every human or animal bone, and in the marvelous structure of the brain and heart. When human beings need wisdom in order to understand things, that is, when we extract wisdom from them, this shows that wisdom is inherent in the things themselves. For no matter how hard we might try to understand things with wisdom-filled ideas, we would not be able to extract wisdom from these things if it were not present in them to begin with. If we want to use wisdom to grasp things that we think have not received wisdom themselves, we might as well believe that we can get water from a glass that has not had any poured into it. As it will be shown later on in this book, the Earth is the resurrected old moon. It appears as a wisdom-filled formation, because the spirits of wisdom imbued it with their forces during the period just described. It should be understandable that this book's description of conditions on the moon necessarily emphasized only some of their transitory evolutionary forms. In this flow of events, certain things had to be selected and emphasized for the sake of description, so to speak. Naturally, such a description of evolution yields only separate images, and may therefore seem the worse for not being incorporated into a context of fixed and definite concepts. In response to this objection, let it be said that this description was deliberately given in the form of less concise concepts, because the point here is not so much to build constructs of speculative concepts and ideas as to give an idea of what can actually present itself when spiritual sight turns to these facts. And with regard to the moon phase of evolution, what presents itself in this way simply does not have the clear and definite contours that earthly perceptions reveal. During the moon epoch, we are dealing with very changeable, vacillating impressions, with mobile, fluctuating images, and the transitions between them. In addition, we must consider the fact that the evolution in question took place over long, long periods of time, and that we can only select certain momentary images to emphasize when describing it. Essentially, the high point of the moon phase of evolution was reached when, thanks to the astral bodies implanted in them, human beings had advanced far enough so that their physical bodies made it possible for the sons of life to achieve their human stage. At that point, human beings had also achieved everything that this phase could give them for themselves, and the progress of their inner development. What followed, the second half of the moon phase of evolution, could therefore be described as a period of abatement. Nonetheless, something important happened during this period with regard to human beings themselves and their surroundings. Wisdom was implanted into the sun-moon body. As we have seen, the seminal nuclei for the mind and sentient souls were laid down during this period of abatement. Not until the earth phase of evolution, however, did they unfold, together with the consciousness soul, so that the birth of the I of independent self-awareness could take place. At the moon stage, the mind and sentient souls were not yet actual expressions of human beings themselves. Rather, these soul elements appeared as instruments for the sons of life, who belonged to these human beings. What human beings on the moon felt with regard to this would have to be described as follows. The Son of Life lives in me and through me, sees the moon environment through me, and thinks in me about the things and beings of this environment. Moon humans felt themselves overshadowed by their Son of Life. They felt like tools for this higher being. During the separation of sun and moon, At times when the moon was turned away from the sun, they felt a greater degree of independence, but they also felt as if the I belonging to them, which disappeared from their pictorial consciousness during the sun periods, then became visible to them. For moon humans, what we described as a change in their state of consciousness gave them the feeling that during the sun periods their I drifted away from them into higher regions to sublime beings, and that it descended with them into lower worlds when the sun disappeared. The actual evolutionary phase of the moon had been preceded by preparatory periods, during which the Saturn and Sun phases were repeated in a certain way. Similarly, we can distinguish two epochs within the time of abatement after the reunification of Sun and Moon. During these epochs, things even condensed physically to a certain degree. Thus the Sun-Moon formation alternated between states that were soul-like or spiritual in character and states that were physical. In the physical epochs, human beings, and also the beings of the lower kingdoms, appeared as stiff figures that were not independent, but seemed to foretell what they were meant to become later during the earth phase in a more independent way. We can thus speak of two preparatory epochs in the moon phase and two different ones during the time of abatement. Epochs such as these can be called cycles. In what followed the two preparatory epochs, but preceded those of the abatement, that is the time of the moon's separation from the sun, we will also be able to distinguish three epochs. The middle one is the time when the sons of life became human. This was preceded by an epoch whose circumstances were all focused on this main event, and it was followed by another in which the beings in question found their way into and developed their new creations. Thus the middle portion of the moon phases is divided into three epochs, along with two preparatory epochs and the two epochs of abatement. This makes a total of 7 moon cycles. We can therefore say that the entire moon phase of evolution ran its course in 7 cycles. The periods of rest between these cycles have already been described several times. We only arrive at an accurate idea of this state of affairs, however, if we imagine that there were no abrupt transitions between periods of rest and periods of activity. For example, the sun beings withdrew gradually from their activity on the moon. For them, an apparent period of rest began while there was still lively independent activity taking place on the moon. The active period of one order of beings often overlaps with the rest period of others. If we take this into account, we can talk about a rhythmic, cyclical rising and falling of forces. Similar divisions can be observed even within the 7 moon cycles that were pointed out above. We can call the entire moon phase of evolution one great cycle, one planetary cycle, in which case the 7 divisions within it constitute smaller cycles, and their parts still smaller cycles. This division into 7 times 7 sections was already noticeable during the Sun phase, and a suggestion of it was even present during the Saturn phase. However, we must consider the fact that the boundaries between sections were already blurred on the Sun, and even more so on Saturn. These boundaries became ever clearer as evolution continued toward the Earth phase. That's the end of paragraph 58 on page 197, and that will be the end of this section, and I will begin with the Earth description next.